Starting streaming. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another BTR stream, Sowing Discourse, with the great Alexander Bard. I want to ask everybody who's watching this right now who has not done so already to please subscribe and help us grow. And thank you so much for being here. So Alexander Bard, he is a great man, Swedish author, lecturer, artist, songwriter, music producer, TV personality, religious and political activist, and one of the founders of the Syntheist religious movement alongside his co-author, Jan Söderqvist. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah, that's okay.
So, Alexander, thank you so much for being here. And just to start off, could you talk a little bit about basically your life, how you transitioned into becoming a pop star, into becoming a new spiritual leader, for lack of a better word, and philosopher?
Well, I knew I had talent for philosophy. So already when I was a kid, I would read Hegel and Nietzsche and try to understand those guys. So that was ultimately my goal. I also knew I could write. So becoming an author one day was a goal that I set out. And I started with theater, actually. When I was a teenager already, I was over in the States. I went to drama school and, expected to do theater. I wrote my first play when I was 19 and directed it. But I discovered theater to me was too old fashioned. I was more interested in technology. And I wanted to do something artistic that was tied in with technology. And this was the 1980s when the synthesizer arrived, the sequencer arrived. And I think I was one of the first music producers in the world who used strictly technology in my work. So I would have a studio with no musicians and just machines and me. Of course, that's the standard way of making music these days, but that was quite unique in the 1980s. So that's how I got involved with the music industry. I was 23 years old when I got discovered. I had my first #1 record in Europe the year after. And then I had a really successful period of, say, 20 years in the music industry. And also eventually ran my own record company with a partner and had music publishing groups and things like that, and several hit records in the States in the 1990s. But I gradually developed my skill for writing. And I also knew you can't really do something like philosophy until you're at least 40 years old. Heidegger and Wittgenstein were the exceptions. They debuted when they were young, but they always regretted those books, even if those books were the ones they were famous for. Heidegger fought with the image of himself after Sein und Zeit, or time and being, the rest of his life. And the same thing, being in time, that's what it's called in English, the rest of his life. And the same thing for Wittgenstein, his Tractatus. So I kind of expected to wait and maybe make my debut as a philosopher later. Had a great career in the music industry. And then eventually, I was 39 years old. Söderqvist and I debuted with our first book, The Netocrats, which came out in the year 2000. And since then, we've done philosophy properly. We've written 5 books. We're working on our 6th book now. We got a team. We're traveling around the world. We do tons of research before we actually write. And we're going to write our 6th book now and probably publish it in, say, 2 to 3 years.
So
that's where I'm at.
Your first 3 books, they were known collectively as the Futurica trilogy, and I started reading it today, actually, and I'm very fascinated by more revelations that this book is going to bring about. But do you see, in short, what do you see going on right now with the internet, with the way that people have changed since the 80s, since you were producing music?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was the whole point in writing the books. I mean, you sit down and you read the entire history of philosophy. In our case, not only the Western, but also the Eastern tradition. So you read all of philosophy, you study everything, you travel. Then you discover that you actually have something meaningful to say that hasn't been said before. Philosophy is an art form. And art, it's all about exclusivity and originality. You can't copy something and then call it philosophy. You can't copy something and call it art. That's just reproduction. So if I, for example, study philosophy and I become a professor of philosophy, I'm merely a teacher of philosophy. I'm not actually a philosopher proper. It's the same thing with art. If you study art, eventually, academically, you can become an art teacher or a teacher of art history, but you don't become an artist. Artist or philosopher are actually titles that are discursive. That means you become a philosopher the day that other philosophers start quoting you and regard you as a philosopher. So it's a discursive phenomenon. And that happened instantly. I think when we wrote The Netocrats, the first book, we rather regarded ourselves as sociologists or anthropologists, but actually because we're studying the internet, and this was the year 2000, and we knew that everything people thought about the internet was basically wrong. The internet was much more profound than people thought, and it would cause havoc on a massive scale before it actually matured. And that was the thesis of that book 20 years ago. And because we said that, we also invented new concepts to understand the internet revolution. And the moment you move from studying something with published with scientific facts, which is what sociology tries to do, the moment you move to actually describing a whole new phenomenon, where you describe concepts that people can then use to try to understand the phenomenon. So you sort of nail it, you try to nail what's going on. Then you become a philosopher. That's what philosophy is. It's the art form of producing new concepts.
Who are some of your favorite modern living philosophers?
Oh, I owe tons to Deleuze and Guattari, and I think most people regard me as a Deleuzian. But I would say that when it comes to the European tradition, I'm one of those guys who break radically with Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant is an amazing philosopher. He made a huge turn in philosophy by introducing phenomenology, and therefore changed the conditions for philosophy. But it's actually Hegel, who followed later after Kant, who made me think. You study Hegel carefully, not to actually think the thoughts he had, but you learn how to think properly from Hegel. And I think these days, we're going through a massive paradigm shift as society is changing as radically as it is. It's becoming digitalized, globalized, actually more than ever. Then you have to go to a guy like Hegel to rethink how the world operates today. If you know Slavoj Žižek, for example, I think most people in Europe regard him as a sort of dominant leftist Hegelian today, and they probably regard me as Söderqvist to be the dominant rightist Hegelians today. So that's what we work with. And then after Hegel comes, of course, Nietzsche and Freud and Jung and all the other guys that inspired me enormously.
Well, in Wikipedia, it's listed that you consider yourself to be a libertarian Marxist. Would you agree with that definition?
Yeah, I actually, you know Brandon O'Neill from the UK, the Irish guy from the UK? He runs Spiked Online. Okay, Spiked Online is the most magnificent news website from Europe. And he's great. Brandon O'Neill and I are both good friends with Thaddeus Russell. So we've done podcasts with him. We kind of think alike. And what I mean with saying that I'm a Marxist libertarian is that I think the only fair way of describing society is to use the class analysis model. And all that work started with Marx. And also the problem with Nietzsche is that Nietzsche works himself towards a hero called the Übermensch. But please note that Übermensch is a singular person. So he sort of completes the idea of individualism, which I'm actually against. I think human beings are tribal creatures and highly social creatures. And therefore, it makes more sense to go back to Marx's idea of the proletarian and then ask ourselves, who is really the proletarian today? What would Marx say about society today? For example, The Netocrats, our first book in the year 2000, is a very Marxist book. It makes a proper Marxist class analysis of the internet society or network society, and studies it not from the perspective of capitalism, like Marx said, but from the perspective of attentionalism, which is exactly where society has arrived. We measure attention these days. We don't measure capital any longer. And that's exactly why capital has become cheap and attention has become so damn expensive. So we just rethought these guys. And then we use Nietzsche, we use Deleuze, we use Spinoza, we use Freud. The last book, Digital Libido, uses Freud all over the place. Like, what would Freud say about contemporary society? How would he look at contemporary society? And because we're looking at the internet age, which Freud never could have, it becomes different than whatever Freud said in the past.
Well,
that was hold on. That was going to be my next question. So I'm really glad. That was awesome. That was really interesting. Peter, do you know Peter Thiel says he's a libertarian Marxist? I'm a Hayekian Marxist, so I guess that's technically a libertarian Marxist as well. But I imagine everyone has their own designations and their own variations on, what the nuances of that means. I was also curious if there are any living philosophers that you find very interesting, or like maybe in a opposing space.
Oh, you mean opposing to me?
Not necessarily, just currently living.
Oh, yeah. Deleuze
philosophers that you like, or
Deleuze died in the 1990s, so that's quite recently. And No, of course, yeah. I mean, Simon Critchley is an old friend of mine. I think he's a brilliant philosopher. He works from New York. He's still at the New School, probably because they pay him well to stay. Otherwise, he'd be frustrated in American academia at the moment. But Simon Critchley writes beautiful books, and he also approaches topics that you kind of go, why would you write a book on dead philosophers? That's a bestseller he wrote. Why would you write a book called The Faith of the Faithless that he wrote? Why would you write? His latest book is called Tragedy, the Greeks and Us. But when you read him, you realize, oh, wow, that's why he approaches this topic, because he actually says more about the age we live in and where we're heading than anybody who takes on the usual expected topics. And that's when you love a philosopher, when he actually opens the door to a whole new space and looks at the world from that space, from that perspective. That's really intelligent, right? So Critchley has that. I think Zizek is wonderful. I think Zizek, just like me and Söderqvist, he works from Hegel, starts from there, and he exposes more about contemporary society than hardly anybody else. It's not his bestsellers, those best books, actually. It's the books where he actually made a great effort to make a real work of philosophy. So it's rather the thick and more narrow books coming out of Zizek, like The Parallax View and Less Than Nothing, that is most brilliant works. I think Jordan Peterson is probably going to become a philosopher. You know, he's gone through quite an ordeal with psychiatry and all that shit the last year. But I know Jordan is writing, and after he's written these books on how to get your shit together and stuff like that, and he did great work on anthropology in the 1990s when I discovered Jordan. I hope he can become a philosopher. He certainly has the mind of one, and he certainly has a pedagogical genius for explaining his thinking. I think he's a great contemporary philosopher too. And I know these guys. Nick Land, for example, he lives in China these days and he's highly controversial for his dark enlightenment texts and all that shit. But Nick is amazing. He's an amazing thinker. When I have a conversation with him, I'm just flabbergasted at how many bright, original, deep ideas that comes out of his mind.
What do you think of Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. The only problem I have is that, I think Ayn Rand was great for me as an inspiration as a pop songwriter. I had a band called Vacuum. And Jules probably knows about it because we were fashion models just like him. But that was in the late 1990s, and we were big in Italy and Russia. And that band, Vacuum, we wrote songs called Illuminati and Atlas Shrugged and things like that, because Ayn Rand was great inspiration for a pop band. And we were kind of hardcore synthesizer, electronic, elitist looking, right? So, but, Ayn Rand is an incredibly mediocre thinker. And the problem is that when you approach autism and philosophy at the same time, autism is often a form of high intelligence where you're really great at something, but you're not necessarily generalist. But the problem is that philosophy proper, great thinkers throughout history, have always been generalists and not specialists. So it's probably better if you have sort of an autistic personality to be a specialist and go into Bitcoins and use your mathematical genius or something, and then you become really successful. And you can become a provocative activist because of that. But philosophy is not about provocation in itself. It's not about extremity in itself, or radicality even. Philosophy really is about going into deep history and then try to nail the human condition properly. And that takes a generalist mindset. So that's exactly why I'd be careful to popularize these fascinating characters that they are, and then turn them into philosophers proper, because that's a very, very different ballgame. In general, I would say the best thinkers are the ones that are not popular at all. Although Hegel was popular during his lifetime, but he was kind of unique. That's why Critchley's book, The Book of Dead Philosophers, is so interesting, because when it comes to writers and artists, we know some of them are only discovered after they die, like Kafka. But when it comes to philosophers, they usually only get discovered long after they die, because people simply don't understand them. So they don't get popular when they write, but they just stay the course with the topic they're fascinated with. And in this sense, being a philosopher means that you don't compromise on your ideas and your text. And you realize that for me and Söderqvist, it's like, if we're the only two people in the world who are interested in this or who get what we're doing, we should still do it and just pursue it relentlessly. And maybe somebody in the future will discover it, but who cares? I'm not in the popularity game at all. I am in the quality game completely.
Are you familiar with Jason Giorgiani at all?
I know Jason Reza Giorgiani really well. Yes, we're both students of Khosraviani Irani in America in the 1990s, and we of course take a great interest in Iranian philosophy. Giorgiani ends up as a proper racist. He hates Turks and Mongols, and he saves his ass by not hating Jews. So Americans usually don't discover those kind of racists. And he has several other problems. Giorgiani, I disagree fundamentally. He's flirting too much with Gnosticism and then tries to apply Gnosticism on all of Central Asian history, which I think is a major mistake. Gnosticism only arrives in the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, at about the time when we start counting time, which is like right after Christ. Anno Domini, that would be like the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries when Gnosticism explodes. But Gnosticism actually was not regarded highly at all during Zoroastrianism and when the Persian empires blossomed. Rather, they were strictly monist religion. They had strictly monist religion that actually persecuted the Gnostics. And this is where Giorgiani and I differ, historically speaking. So say historically, we both love Zoroaster and regard him as one of the greatest thinkers ever and still to be discovered by the West. If you work in Eastern philosophy, Zoroaster was one of the greatest thinkers ever. But we differ in that I say Zoroaster and Heraclitus among the Greeks should be read in parallel because they think alike. Heraclitus was by the way, he wasn't even a Greek. Why we sort of picked all his little texts together and took them together and then basically published them and called them the fragments. If you read Heraclitus, you read Heraclitus, the fragments. That was because the fragments were spread all over Greece, but they were fragments from a philosopher that Kurdish origin. He was a Persian, Western Persian. And that's exactly why Persian thinking is Heraclitus. And if you read Zoroaster and Heraclitus next to each other, you discover that they're strictly monist, they're process philosophers, process thinking that's so cherished today starts with these two guys. And this is what Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger later pointed out when they turned against Plato and instead proposed Heraclitus as the really amazing Greek. Nietzsche and Heidegger were adamant that Heraclitus was the greatest Greek and not Plato. And that shift away from Plato and dualism over to Heraclitus and monism is fundamental to our philosophy in the West today. But we should trace that all the way back to reading Zoroaster and Heraclitus. And this is where Giorgiani and I differ. And that's exactly because we differ on that we arrive at such a totally different idea of the forthcoming Persian Renaissance that we both prophesize about.
There was another thing that Giorgiani touched on, which was the mystery school of Mithraism, and I was really fascinated by the way that he was describing that in his book. How much of that actually happened the way that he described, I have no idea, but to make a long story short about that idea, it's that Mithra was a symbol, the entity of the precession of the equinoxes, where the earth would go through all of these different times. And the idea being there that people are constantly rebelling against Zervan, this double-gendered god of time, basically raging against this structure of order, trying to be the eternal rebels. And there is something fascinating to me about that. And as far as how old that is, Giorgiani, I think he says that that's even older than Zoroastrianism. So I was wondering...
He's right on those things. He's right on many things. I would say Zoroaster only called himself a reformer. And what he introduced to Zoroastrianism was that he introduced a philosophy. You know, the word philosophia was a word that the Greeks took from the Persians. Philosophia, the love of wisdom, in Persian is Mazda Yasna. And Mazda Yasna was the name of Zoroaster's religion. In the East, there is no difference between religion and philosophy at all. We only separated religion and philosophy in the West 400 years ago for power reasons. This was because of a struggle within academia. So you could keep theology under the control of the church, whereas philosophy would then be a secular enterprise separated from the church. Otherwise, if you talk to somebody from India or China and you say philosophy is one thing and religion is another, they just go, what? Why would you separate those two things? It's just thinking. It's just thinking on the human condition, thinking on the world and how it operates. So Zoroaster constructed a philosophy called Zoroastrianism. And that remains. The text of Zoroaster is called the Gathas. It's one of the most amazing texts ever written. It basically sets the conditions for creating civilization. it's incredibly phallic, right? It's all about how do you build a better tomorrow? How do you build a stable society? How to build a society that's peaceful and prosperous over time? Why is that different from nomadic life, which is what Zoroaster and the other guys in Central Asia came out of? Because they had created a settled society and they had written language. And because they had written language, they realized, oh, we can accumulate information and knowledge. That means Deleuze would say that that is the revolution Deleuze was looking for, and I think I found with Söderqvist. That was the revolution where the son can imagine that he can create a better world than his father did, because he can improve in the world. The idea that you can improve in the world is called eventology, by the way. And the first eventological idea ever in human history was written by Zoroaster, 1700 before Christ. It's called Gothas. And that was the condition for the Persian Empire that lasted for 1400 years. It was later mimicked in a terrible way by the Egyptians when the Egyptians invented dictatorship. And they did so under Akhenaten. It's called Atonism, which ironically happens to be the origin of the Jewish religion, which Freud exposed. So this is fascinating. And between Judaism and Zoroastrianism, you really find a really grown-up debate in the Middle East over all of Middle Eastern history, whereas Christianity and Islam are just like more American pop culture phenomena.
How likely?
The problem with Christianity and Islam is that you never get the depth in Christianity and Islam you get from Judaism and Zoroastrianism. But to go back to Giorgiani here, what Giorgiani discovered, and I agree with him, is that you actually have two other religions that operate in parallel with Zoroastrianism. And the mistake he makes is that he doesn't understand that Mithraism is strictly a military religion. And when you study Mithraism, it was also the military religion of the Roman Empire. There were Mithraea all over the Roman Empire. And all the way up to the 5th century, Mithraism looked like it was going to be the winner in the war between religions in Europe before Christianity took over. So he was standing in between Christianity and Mithraism, and because the Roman Empire was a dictatorship, only one could win. And eventually Christianity won. And we arrived with the Christian West and the separation of church and state. We could have kept church and state both religious by just declaring the religion of the church could have been Christianity, the religion of the state could have been Mithraism, and would have a system that is much similar to China and India, than rather the separation of church and state that had caused so much problems in Europe. But Zoroastrianism was ultimately the religion of the priests. And this is what's lacking in Giorgiani's analysis. Zoroastrianism was practiced by the priests only, like the ultimate truth, the ultimate hardcore, horrible truth about reality is something that only priests are grown up enough to understand and grasp. And that's Zoroastrianism. And Zorovan is essentially the real God, which is a gender-neutral monster that doesn't care about humans. And another name for Zorovan is, of course, time. So now you're curious, you can jump all the way up to Heidegger and realize why Heidegger wrote Being and Time and why he was obsessed with time. You understand why Hegel was obsessed with time and process, why Nietzsche was obsessed with time and process, and why this is the radical break with the philosophy of being, which is the philosophy all the way up to Kant.
Well, what's interesting about it is amazing. What was interesting about Giorgiani's take on this too is that he is very fascinated by the idea of time travel. In your TEDx talk, you are basically saying that until somebody brings me the evidence for this, I am not going to even entertain the possibility. But it's been a fascinating thing for me to think about too, whether or not the world that we're living in right now has certain things that we consider to be limitations that may not actually be there, where just like a dog has no idea what a highway is, we have no idea what these other higher forces that are working on us are.
But these are the fantasies of Gnostics, and I hate Gnosticism, and I think it's stupid, because if time travel, it could only be possible if there was something even lower than time that time is submitted to. But the only thing that's lower than time that time has submitted to is something called hypertime. So that's like the other dimension of time. That's like what's prior to time. And you still end up with the time axis. And the evidence for that is that you can't think outside of time. You can think outside of space. You can't think outside of time. Everything is temporal.
Weren't they saying recently, I don't know the study in depth, that they recently sent a particle back in time?
No. That's because time is not fixed. If time is not completely continuous. No, it's not completely discrete. So there's an element of time that isn't completely discrete. That allows for little reverberations to happen, but that's how anything operates. Everything is fundamentally moving on a small scale. That's fundamental to quantum physics, or quantum organics, as I call it, which should probably be called. It's not quantum mechanics, it's quantum organics. If you study quantum organics, you find out that at the ultimate level, everything is moving. And because everything is moving, existence itself is possible. But it's only within that little reverberation that you can actually have something that can travel backwards, because it's not traveling backwards as much as it's kind of small circular loops that are occurring. You know, loop quantum gravity, for example, studies these things. It's so minor. It's unbelievable. No, you can't just travel back in time. That's just Hollywood bullshit.
No, of course.
And the problem with that is that, yeah, boys love ideas of having, you know, being omnipresent and omnipowerful and, you know, rule the world. 11-year-olds love that. I call these 11-year-olds throughout history boy pharaohs and pillar saints. And my problem is that the Gnostics, they always these boys who don't get involved with a fully grown-up game. They don't go to war and they don't fuck. And if you don't endorse yourself in sexuality and violence, you can't do proper theater either. You don't do art.
That is hilarious.
Then you end up in the realm.
That is so funny.
Yeah, you end up in a realm where you're like a permanent 11-year-old. It's called Peter Pan syndrome. And it's always the Peter Pan boys who dream about time travel. It's always a nerdy thing to do.
What about a
porn
wormhole?
star who dreams about time travel, right? And you don't mean a warrior who goes to war dreams about time travel, because actually the fact they're temporal beings and that they're located in time that makes their actions so powerful and meaningful.
That's hilarious. What about, so a wormhole, that's a loophole. That's not technically time travel. So if we opened a wormhole and we were able to, so that's, okay, technicality.
The wormhole exists in a world that is temporal. So you travel a long time, even if you travel through a wormhole. What's important, though, and this is where physicists have to read stuff, the kind of work that we do, and they're interested in it, because they've obviously discovered now through Baudrillard's equation in 2011, they discovered that it's way more likely that our current universe started with a big bounce rather than a big bang. So we had an imploding universe that preceded the current one. Now, the problem, though, is that space-time, as you know it, classic space-time, Einsteinian space-time, starts after the big bounce. And it's like a weave. This is what you do when you do loop quantum gravity. So that starts after the big bang or the big bounce itself. Well, you got a problem then, don't you? Because there is something prior to the initial expansion of space-time. That means that space-time, if that is a physical phenomenon, we need to discuss something called subphysics, which is a physics prior to physics. The way biology follows physics, there's something prior to physics, and we now call it subphysics. And when you work your way through subphysics, you got to work with concepts. You got to allow yourself to work with concepts called hypertime and hyperspace. Like, what if there's a space within which space can expand? What if there's a time onto which time happens and suddenly occurs as an emergence? And when you discuss that, you realize that hypertime actually becomes even a necessity to understand existence as we know it. And once you have hypertime, it's different time dimension, then that hypertime has a different quality. That's what we're studying now. Ooh, it gets really weird when you study hypertime. It's probably more circular rather than linear, although we don't know that yet. But hypertime also has the quality that it just relentlessly moves on. So whereas we've learned from Einstein that time can travel, you know, at different speeds. If you know, example, if you go in the rocket, you leave the planet, you come back, and you got a twin brother, suddenly your twin brother is older than you were because you did the rocket trip. But that's only because our bodies are adapted to Einsteinian time, space-time, but really below that, that's when it gets interesting. You move into Zurvanite Persian territory, right? Below that, there's a hypertime that actually everything else dances on. And that hypertime has a structure where it's not infinite in any direction, rather it has a more circular structure to it.
That was the Persian philosopher. How do you pronounce his name again? Cervantes?
No, Servan is a god.
Servan.
So you had a priestly religion that was never written down. That's exactly what we only know about it after Zoroastrians have written about it later. So Zoroastrianism is the dominant religion in the Persian empires. It was a beautiful religion, right? It has aura, which is being, and it has masta, which is mind. So it doesn't have anything supernatural all in it. That's exactly why they're not Gnostic, they're monists. And they believe that when you die, you die. That's exactly why they never built pyramids. Why would you build pyramids like the Egyptians did? The Egyptians spent every penny they had on building pyramids because they started believing in afterlife. So dualism and Gnosticism took off first in Egypt. And dualism has its origin in Egyptian thinking. That's why I always call Plato the Egyptian Greek, and I call Heraclitus the Persian Greek. And we understand the difference between Persian and Egyptian culture and thinking in antiquity. We understand why the Greeks were divided between the two. But the Persians just took the corpses of the dead and threw them out in the desert and had vultures eat them. So they recycled the bodies instantly because they were just dead. They literally were just dead to the Zoroastrians. Because if you live in a monist universe, then you die when you die, you're born when you're born, and there's no place for you to go to experience any afterlife. And there is no time to travel through. You're stuck in time and you cannot escape it. That's Zoroastrian.
The Jews seem to have
Didn't the
borrowed
Egyptians? Sorry, love. Didn't the Egyptians build the pyramids as a way of like it was their version of cryogenic freezing? They wanted to be revived, so they thought if they built themselves as close as possible to the heavens and preserved themselves, that in the future they could be brought back.
Well, they slaughtered a lot of animals and wives and things and put in the pyramids too. And they also had, like, if you've gone to the pyramids, you know that you have windows out towards the sun, so the sun can get into the pyramid at certain occasions. Yeah, kind of. I mean, cryogenics today is kind of the next attempt at escaping your mortality. So my philosophy is very strict when it comes to these things. It's like Söderqvist and I work with 3 terrible ideas that came from the Egyptians and then arrived at Platonism. And these terrible ideas are perfection, immortality, and infinity. But we dissect these ideas and deconstruct them and expose that they're flawed by just thinking them through properly. You think through perfection properly, it's only a person who loves still photographs who can think of perfection. Because the moment anything changes in a state of perfection, it becomes imperfect. So nothing can stay perfect.
Right.
It's an important lesson to learn. For example, if you do psychedelics or you have great sex and you go into an ecstatic mode, it's like real ecstasy has the nature of it that you can't stay there. It would be horrible if you stay there, but you can experience it ecstatically and love it, knowing it's temporal and it's only temporary, and you will get out of it, and then you can memorize it. That's fundamental to understanding how you use psychedelics and don't become an addict. Because the addict is always somebody who goes back to the same state compulsively again and again to try to experience again and again. Whereas you learn that if you had an ecstatic mindset and you can just memorize it, you don't have to experience it again, is what makes you a real shaman, for example. So this is one example of how you work with temporality and spirituality. So no, the problem we have is that we inherited the Egyptian tradition, and eventually that became Manichaeism and Mastakism. And Manichaeism turned out to be Christianity later through Augustine, and Mastakism later became Islam, and it's also the origin of socialism. So a lot of the ideas we have now started in the Persian Empire and were later developed, but I go back to the Persian Empire to find Mastak and Mani and the Gnostics and how they struggled with the Zoroastrian priesthood. And it's a fascinating period from about the birth of Christ all the way up to the 7th century when the struggle goes on in the Persian Empire. I think it's a golden age for thinking.
Well, the Mazdakites, they were with... Oh, just 1 second, Jules. The Mazdakites, they were also for free love, right? Like, there was a lot of sex that was going on during that period, according to Giorgiani, until the authorities started cracking down on it. And that's when
because Giorgiani doesn't sleep around a lot, apparently, because he loves Mastak because of it. Aren't hippies always the guys who don't have a lot of sex but fantasize about it? Whereas those of us who have a lot of sex, have had in the past, also realize it can cause a lot of havoc. So we get more modest about it. And that's exactly why Giorgiani ends up as a dualist and a Gnostic, and I end up as a radical monist. And he would agree with me that I'm the Zoroastrian and he's not. So he calls himself a Mithraist to try to save his ass and think Mithraism was a kind of Gnostic exercise. I doubt that highly, but he can be in that realm if he wants to. I prefer to stay within Zoroastrianism proper, and it's an incredibly monist religion. It says that there's one world, everything in this world affects everything else. It's called gravity, if nothing else, which is exactly the world we've arrived at today. And this worldview operates with time as its foundation. So everything is temporal, everything is processed, everything is constantly moving, constantly changing. And we human beings fool ourselves because we phenomenologically try to freeze the world to try to study it and understand it. And that's what we do with perception. That's why phenomenology is so important. But we must not think that our frozen perceptions of the world are the world. They are strictly perceptional. They're phenomenological. They're not the world as it is. This was Kant's great insight. Whereas the world as it is constantly moves and changes and is altered. And we just have to live with that process. I would say we even have to embrace it more. I think we have to migrate more. I think we have to move our asses a lot more than we do and stuff like that, because that'll be healthy to us and be better humans if we did that.
Well, this is something that I think inspires a lot of the people from the esoteric right-wing side of Twitter, where you have people who, let's say, like a Bronze Age pervert, for instance. He writes a lot about these migratory cultures of swashbucklers, and to compare that with someone who sits in a cubicle all day, I could definitely see why there is this urge to reject the modern condition and go on horseback like the Mongols.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and this is Deleuze, for God's sake. I mean, Gilles Deleuze wrote a wonderful little book in the 1980s called Nomadology, The War Machine. And he was totally politically incorrect when he wrote that book. But he was so far above and, ahead of everybody else. People didn't realize that Deleuze wasn't a part of French Marxism. He couldn't care less. He wasn't a part of any of the stuff that the French did at the time. Other guys knew that he was a genius. Foucault said that in the future, we'll live in a Deleuzian age. And I think guys like me and Söderqvist, you guys here, certainly Nick Land, for example, the popularity that Nick Land has reached these days, it just shows that the Deleuzian thinking is the way forward. But I want to warn about trying to approach Deleuze with a Gnostic mindset. It's trying to be Gnostic and then try to approach Nietzsche. It's impossible. Nietzsche was adamantly against Gnosticism. He was aggressively against it. Deleuze was aggressively against any ideas of dualism and Gnosticism. Deleuze and Nietzsche follow in tradition from Zoroaster before them. That's why Nietzsche wrote Also sprach Zarathustra. He knew the character. In Germany in the 19th century, it was high fashion to study Sanskrit and Avesta and go back to the original Indian, Iranian texts and read them. That's where the whole Aryan Brotherhood movement started, right? And I've done the same thing. I just basically realized nobody knows these languages any longer. And anything Zoroaster wrote 3,700 years ago is completely misrepresented in English and German literature. It's completely wrongly translated. It's translated by people of trying to attempt to put Platonism and most of all Christianity onto Zoroaster afterwards, which is completely impossible. You have to understand Persian thinking, you have to understand Persia as an Asian power. Persia was the connection between China and India for thousands of years. This is all about the Silk Route. The revised interest in the Silk Route is fantastic. Because over the next 30 years, you're going to see the entire history of Asia rewritten. Because the history of Asia we've known, this is where John and I come into the picture. The history of Asia we've known in the past is nothing but a European 19th century fantasy. Wow. There was no Buddhism, for example. There were just tons of different schools that sometimes used the Buddha and sometimes didn't. There were meditation technique schools along the Silk Route. They never thought of themselves as a unified ism. They never had a pope. They never had a Mecca. They never had any of these things that we have in the West, where we centralize something and then call it an ism or an ideology. These were just debate clubs, essentially, along the Silk Road. You would go from one oasis to the next and meet people who loved to discuss with you, and who did spiritual journeys and spiritual exercises. And the Taoism and the Buddhism and the Zoroastrianism that we today apply onto the East are actually just different schools of thoughts that influenced each other enormously throughout the ages. I mean, you go to Japan and you study Zen, and then you go to Zen Rock Garden, and then you go to Yazd in Iran, and you go to Zoroastrian Fire Temple, and my God, they look identical. Mm. And you realize, wait a second, is Zen really Buddhist? No, it was when the Europeans came to Asia and said, the Zen has to be qualified as one of the isms, so we'll just call it Buddhism. And then the Zen started rewriting their history as if they were some kind of Buddhist cult. But in reality, Buddhist teachings and Zen meditation in Japan are radically different schools. For example, the Zen don't believe in reincarnation. That's a very Indian idea, but the Japanese do not believe in reincarnation. They believe that when you die, and hopefully you die gracefully, because there's nothing there to reincarnate in the Zen idea of what it means to be human. The soul is never separate from the body. Now, the idea that the soul cannot be separate from the body, which means that you don't want to upload yourself. It would be ultimate hell to live uploaded. You know, it's like, look at Futurama and you realize how being
there's a great Black Mirror about that.
Yeah, exactly. So that good. Yeah. Once you think through these ideas, you realize they're actually horrible. Once you think through perfection, once you think through immortality, once you properly think through infinity, it's just awful, right?
Well, the infinity one
non-existent.
I'm interested in, because the other two terrible ideas, I'm with you 100%. But infinity, I'm not sure why that also is a terrible idea.
Well, infinity cannot be connected with the rest of mathematics. So what you have to do, what you have to do with infinity is you have to put points at the end of any equation, because you cannot actually jump from defined mathematics, real numbers, and then jump into infinity. So they created a separate mathematics called transfinite mathematics, which sort of allow themselves that some infinities are more infinite than other infinities are, which means they're actually limited. So if you think through infinity, you cannot even apply it onto mathematics. When physicists try to throw infinity into the equations, they end up with big bangs. When you remove infinities, like Baudrillard did, from mathematics, you realize there's a big bounce. That's how the big bounce is discovered, right?
So the difference, like the distance between 1 and 2 is an unlimited infinity. And then if you count from 0 to infinity, that's a limited infinity.
Okay, no, what you do between 1 and 2 is that you add continuum. Okay, I don't think continuum exists. So if everything is discretion, that's like the Planck length. And that's where you arrive with loop quantum gravity. You discover that space-time itself exists because it contains discrete units. Now, everything ultimately, there is a smallest possible size for something to meaningfully exist, at which the reverberations that are happening can actually reverberate with the next unit. You always arrive at the smallest possible unit. In our philosophy, we call whatever is below the Planck length or below the Planck time, we just call pure chaos. So we remove it from the equations completely. And then we force the mathematicians to work with proper equations with discrete units. Now, if you have discrete units between 1 and 2, which is how reality works, not mathematics, how reality works, then mathematics, if mathematics is returned and becomes a representation of reality again, which it used to be before you added zeros and infinities to it, but then you discover they're actually discrete units, and you just have to figure out how small those discrete units are, but then it becomes finite. And in reality, everything is finite.
Are you familiar with David Deutsch, the author of The Beginning of Infinity?
Yeah, sloppy title to begin with. I would say The Beginning of Enormity. And in our work, we use enormities and enormitesimal's instead of infinitesimals, because infinitesimals is just lazy mathematics to me. If you think through mathematics properly, you end up with enormitesimalities. And you can count on, especially today we have computers to help us out, we can certainly count on those and make the equations much better. And again, the reason why Baudrillard exposed there was a flaw to the Big Bang model was because it allowed continua and it allowed infinities in the mathematics. And if you don't allow that, you don't end up with infinite temperature at the beginning of the Big Bang. You end up with finite temperature of a pressure where you take an entire universe and force that universe into one Planck length. It's enormous pressure, right? Enormous heat, but it is limited. It is finite. And that is absolutely essential if you're going to move into the next stage of natural science and things like that, to remove the infinities from the equations. And it's also, to me, again, we need to get these Platonist ideas of infinity and perfection and immortality out of the way, because if you're going to have a philosophy of what it means to be human and now preparing the human towards meeting the machine, then we got to get back to reality. I'm a realist philosopher, and that's what I work with.
When it comes to quantum physics, I don't know if I have this right exactly, but what about the observer affecting what is observed at that level? What would you say is the significance
at every level?
Oh, there is interaction always. There's always a minimal influence of some kind. I mean, something that exists like way away from us somewhere in the universe still has an effect on us, even if it's small, right? So it's just, that's where the continua comes into the picture. And again, maybe the problem with Einsteinian mathematics and with quantum organics is that why they never unifies, because Einstein actually allowed himself to work with continua. But if you end up with an Einsteinian improved mathematics that use discretion, even at these sort of very, very small levels, say, for example, gravity from outer space, you could probably arrive at something that actually can be combined. I think that is the trick left to be done by the physicists. So maybe that answers the question. I don't know, but there's always interaction, but the observer affecting something in a laboratory during quantum physics, I am much more interested in David Bohm's work, for example, on pilot waves. And I think that's the way to go forward in physics. I think Lee Smolin has already made that turn. I think Leonard Susskind has already made that turn. What happened in the 2010s was the discovery that information expands all the time and information is never destroyed in the current universe. It probably takes a big collapse prior to big bounce for information to be destroyed. We probably have no information. We'll never access the information from previous universe. We don't know that yet, we probably don't. But if information is what expands all the time, that also explains why the universe itself is expanding. It is information itself that's expanding. You even have the holographic principle here, is that anywhere you look in the universe, all the information contained within that section of the universe could actually be flattened down to two-dimensional picture, which is the perspective. And that's called systemic perspectivism. This is what physicists are working on now. This is where it's going. Superstring theory, we're locked up. There could be something to it, but we have to go in another direction to see if it's meaningful later. And that's exactly why I read Edward Witten more like a metaphorical thinker who inspires me rather than I read him as a physicist, whereas I think guys like Susskind and Smolin are on to where physics is going next. And they're amazing thinkers and scientists.
Being a young buck myself right now, this is all very fascinating for me, and I want to learn as much as I can about it. My own current, very naive view, perhaps, at looking at what exactly is going on here is I see a lot of things that I've experienced personally in my life as being very relevant to things occurring for the sake of me having certain educational experiences. But I don't really know if that is something that can be philosophized, because some people, they go as far as to say that we're living in this not empty, but we're living in this dead machine, and that everything is already programmed to act in a certain way. And I view this as far as this consciousness that I possess.
Damn Gnostics again. It's a damn Gnostics again. No, if it is pre-programmed, then where the heck did that pre-programming occur? Some kind of a space somewhere by somebody. And you're back at Christianity and the creator God again. It's just like, can we please close that door for good and not try to return there? You know.
Well, before that, we have a comment from Gio Panichetti, who's going to be joining us later. Gio's a great guy. He says, "Ask Alex to destroy Lawrence Krauss's "The Universe from Nothing" nonsense."
Oh yeah, I done that already. I said it's called the Big Bounce.
Yes. Okay, so that is already...
So the giants of India are right. We live through eons of time, enormous eons of time, where everything is just like a pulse back and forth. And that is probably the most correct idea how the universe operates that we know so far. That also means I'm not particularly interested in parallel universe. So I think that's also one of those cheap ways of getting out of problems that should be solved. And Lee Small and these other guys agree with me completely on that one.
Well,
Lawrence Krauss, Lawrence Krauss, he was the author of the Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing, right? So
why is there something rather than nothing is Leibniz. So that's like one of the oldest questions of philosophy.
Yeah, it goes way back. He wrote a pop book about it, but no, he's nothing new under the sun, 100%. But could there be a side by side? Could you have a big bounce and things? Because the thesis is that nothing is unstable, and things emerge from nothing. So that's why he posits a universe from nothing. So is it possible that you could have, for lack of a better word, I would describe like an infinite universe, while also you have things popping in and out of existence?
You can have things popping in and out of existence as long as there's a balance to it. That means if you have something if you take one force that goes in one direction and you have an opposite force that goes in the other direction and they zero each other out, you can certainly have some kind of expansion or something. We have an expanding universe at the moment, and it's expanding in terms of information. So that's a given. That's a fact, cannot be denied. But when it comes to the universe itself, it's an open question. We haven't really gone into Big Bounce theory since it's only like 10 years old to properly discuss that if a collapsing universe still is maintained somehow at the Planck length under enormous pressure and then expands, and the question is, did everything that has sort of a kind of what we call material existence today, did it already exist back then? And it's just the same thing evening out all the time. Well, it probably has a beginning of some kind somewhere, unless there's something really spooky, weird, circular going on here. Hypertime might show us that. We don't know that yet, but certainly as long as you borrow from out of something and then take it back in again, and that's exactly why everything is reverberating. We agree on that one. So everything is moving all the time. There is less than zero, because there's less than zero, there's existence. So yes, that's not a problem at all with this model. But it's just that the universe itself came out of nothing. It's the idea that the Big Bang was an absolute. And the Big Bang was never really proven. And it ended up with all kinds of new problems. And Lawrence Crescent jumped to this conclusion that, yeah, but I'm going to gamble on the fact the Big Bang is a fact and that everything came out of nothing. Well, wait a second. It started with infinite temperature? That's certainly not nothing. Right. So since you haven't gone beyond the infinite temperature, Mr. Lawrence, then you haven't really solved any problems at all. You're just jumping to conclusions in the pop book, like a lot of guys do. But you should go back to physics and actually either prove what that means, or then just understand that the enormous pressures and the enormous temperatures that existed at what we used to call the Big Bang was actually nothing but a big bounce. It was a collapsing universe that the boom became the universe we have now.
Well, it also sounds a lot to me like the breathing in and breathing out of Brahma, as referred to in some of the Hindu texts. And that brings me to the idea of there seems to be a big separation, at least today, between the mystics and the scientists. And what I'm curious about is this whole idea of as above, so below, where if you look at the human heartbeat and then apply that to so many other things, or the breathing process, or even something like the human body. Like, I've always been of the idea that our body isn't just accident and it isn't just adaptation, that it is, in a certain way, an allegory for the universe. But it's a very romantic take.
No, it is not. You're jumping to conclusions 11-year-olds make again.
I know, it's a very romantic take.
A very romantic take. So, number one, we must re-understand determinism and indeterminism, because determinism and determinism is something we still have left as concept from the idea of the creator God. So those should go away as well. What I'm working on with my team is a new concept called transdeterminism, and I've written about it in the past. The transdeterminism is that, yes, even if everything happens without chance ultimately being involved, it wasn't pre-programmed, it wasn't predestined. So if you're going to get rid of the idea of predestination altogether, most modern determinists would say that they don't believe in predestination. Well, then get rid of the whole term, because determinism implies predestination. That's the whole point. So we work with transdeterminism. We can remove the opposition between determinism and indeterminism, because it turns out in physics, like David Bohm showed, that a system can be indeterminate during a certain time, but it still arrives at the same point from where it looks determinate. So actually everything operates, what we used to call determinism and indeterminism actually operate in parallel all the time. So to think of the world as either being indeterminist or ultimately determinist is ridiculous. We call it transdeterminism. The other one you're talking about is reductionism. And it is the idea that everything can go all the way back to the smallest atom or smallest unit of some kind, and everything else that happens after that becomes a kind of monadic reflection of that condition. But reductionism actually was then developed on the other hand with Whitehead and these other guys called panpsychism. And panpsychism is because consciousness, at least as humans, with our narcissism, would be the most amazing thing ever. I seriously doubt that. And I think
it kind of go with the network theory?
Yeah, it's like subconsciousness is more interesting than consciousness anyway. But anyway, if you think of consciousness and how it possibly operates, if you think it's so damn important, then you go all the way back and you find psyche into the smallest units. Both these ideas are actually just human fantasies. That's not how things operate. What happens is that along the time axis, which is the absolute, along the time axis, certain things suddenly occur, like physics occurs after the big bounce, right? Then something else called chemistry occurs, and then something else called biology occurs, and eventually something called mind occurs. And these things should really, like you do in academics, be studied separately because they operate according to different habits and rules. And we call these emergence vectors. And the idea with such an emergence vector theory is that we just equalize them. We say none of them is primary. Reductionists make the mistake that they make physics primary compared to the others emergence vectors, which is ridiculous. It just happened along the time axis. It has its own rules. It should be studied on its own. Biology is at least as interesting as physics, and physics is not primary to biology in any way whatsoever.
But
by having such an emergence vector theory, we can remove both panpsychism, which is an absurd idea. We can remove reductionism forever from philosophy.
But what makes it move? What makes the emergence emerge?
It just exists. It's just movement and its existence in itself.
But that's what do you mean? What do you mean makes what makes the emergence emerge?
Well, that's always been something fascinating
to
me.
Would you have instability?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So it's not energy that pumps up things. It's not a car. It's not like you put gas in a car, you drive the car. It's instability, exactly. So because if you have two different fields and there is a difference in pressure between these fields, that will start movement right away, right there. And because things are not evenly spread in the universe, they're unevenly spread. That's obviously something that came out of the Big Bangs, was that things were unevenly spread. And as long as things are unevenly spread, that causes movements, and these movements just go on and on forever.
It's just difficult, at least for me right now, to imagine the transition from something like chemical reactions to us having consciousness. And I'm not saying this to say that, oh, we have consciousness is so amazing, but there does seem to be something weird for me, at least at this point, in imagining that transitionary period from no consciousness to consciousness.
Well, I've heard panpsychism compared to integrated information theory, which to me sounded strikingly similar to your network theory, because you were saying that the individual doesn't exist. I would say the self. I just think it's less confusing. I'm just mincing words, and maybe I'm missing something. But if the individual or the self doesn't exist, and we're all there's more of a relational thing going on, like a network theory that you proposed, to me that sounded exactly like integrated information theory in different terms. And again, I might be missing something, but I've heard that as the backing for panpsychism, which is that consciousness is a spectrum, and it's an emergent phenomenon, and it emerges depending on how networked information is.
Well, I would say this. What is a life form? A life form is a membrane of some kind, usually a fatty membrane, that isolates something from the outside world. But it doesn't close it up, because then it would die, right? So your life form has a membrane, and information passes through the membrane, but the membrane then has to have a memory, so the membrane can learn what it should let through and what it should spit out. So this is what Deleuze calls the body, right? So you work from the body, you work from the first earliest life forms to understand that. Now, if it has a memory, it processes information and then it can grow because of that, because it can learn from previous experiences. And even the earliest, smallest life forms have to have memory and a membrane. So you work with membrane theory, which you can do in physics, you can do that in urban planning, you can do that when you build a house. Yeah, membrane theory all the time. There's an exterior and interior to a certain phenomenon, and this phenomenon is moving, and because it is moving and is learning from its outside world, you have the first forms of intelligence. And these things then operate. These are early life forms. And to discuss when consciousness arises, like, well, the vast majority of people are just mimicking machines anyway. They're not really conscious about anything, are they? And reality, when you think of consciousness, you think it through properly, and what philosophers should do, you just realize that the sense of self that you have, this is very Metzinger, this is the ego tunnel. Söderqvist now wrote a book called The Body Machines, if you want to read about it. So the self is essentially something like, it's like a momentum. It's something that occurs when you got to leave a problem you haven't solved. So you got to make up your mind. Say you're a life form, you got to make up your mind whether to let something through or to pass something out of your system. And you can't make up your mind whether you're going to do it or not, because you don't have information enough to actually make that decision. That's when there occurs a sense of self. These senses of selves, we then connect and we try to memorize them. And we have an idea of how we locate these along a timeline that becomes a sense of self, which is historical. So yeah, I was 12 years old when I did this and that. But we all know that when we retell stories about what we did 12 years ago, we kind of make them up. Half of it was true. Some of that didn't happen. And at the end of the day, we might change our mind about it again later. But this is how we create a story about ourselves. And that is a linguistic phenomenon that happens with a talking creature like humans when we talk to each other, try to communicate, because we have discovered we have an advantage about portraying and fantasizing about places that exist that we don't have access to at the moment. So we do storytelling because of it. And all of this then, because we're a tribal creature and we need a power structure within the tribe, means that somebody will yell at you when you're a little baby and shout, you there, you there, you there, until you've internalized that enough linguistically, you think, I, and I'm responsible for things. And this is where Freud comes into the picture. So this is what we then call consciousness, and especially Americans love to make this as the most amazing thing ever. Like God died and went away, so we have to make ourselves into God. So we have to be these conscious creatures. And then Freud comes along and destroys that fantasy by saying that, oh my God, yeah, we're conscious of very little and we make it up afterwards and we construct fantasies that are constantly destroyed for us. Because actually we're subconscious creatures, we're bodies, and our bodies are at least intelligent enough to know when to shit and when to eat and when to spit and when to fuck, whatever we do, and they're called drives. And on top of those drives, we make up little stories about our drives and they're called desires. And this is what humans are. And I'm not particularly interested in consciousness at all. I think the fascination with consciousness is the very narcissistic, anthropocentric exercise that is probably the least interesting thing in philosophy. And Metzinger has basically killed it. You read the Ego Tunnel and you read Being No One and you discover what a self is.
It's still pretty amazing to me, though, to, as narcissistic as it may sound, to be able to experience life as an experiencer. To be able to just, throughout anything that I remember, to be able to see through these eyes and use all these senses. So whatever it may be worth, it's interesting to me. And I would like to bring in a couple of guests right now. But before that, from Giorgiani's Iranian Leviathan, there was a very interesting quote from Heraclitus, where he says, "Men are oblivious of what they do awake, just as they are forgetful of what they do asleep. Although the account is shared, most men live as though their thinking were a private possession. The world of the waking is one and shared, but the sleeping turn aside each into his private world. Thinking is shared by all things. Death is all things that we see awake. All we see asleep is sleep. A man strikes light for himself in the night when his sight is quenched. Living, he touches the dead in his sleep. Waking, he touches the sleeper. Men are asleep, and men asleep are laborers and co-workers in what takes place in the world. Immortals are mortal, mortals immortal. Living, the other's death, dead in the other's life. The same, living and dead, and the waking and sleeping, and the young and old. For these transposed are those, and those transposed again are these."
That's quite the somnambulist passage there.
It's very Zoroastrian, right? And probably in the original Iranian language, the word immortal wasn't even there. It is rather transcendence. It's rather that which is beyond your death. Collaborates with that you do before you die. So that would be more Iranian. But yeah, it's Heraclitan, and you got Zoroastrianism right there. And now you understand why I make the connection and I rewrite the history of ideas and connect Zoroastrianism directly with Hegel and Nietzsche.
It's very interesting. I mean, Giorgiani's personal take on this is that he's implying that the dream world is actually the living world, and this world is one of decay.
Yeah, because he's a Gnostic. And Heraclitus never wrote that. That's his fantasy. So Giorgiani tries to force Plato onto Heraclitus, which is like, don't do that. That's where I disagree with him. Yeah.
Does he? Because Giorgiani says that Plato is the biggest villain of modern philosophy. Maybe he was revealing himself, because I thought Giorgiani was not trying to do that. Maybe it was me projecting. But when I read Prometheus and Atlas, I didn't read Iranian Leviathan, where he's saying that there's suppressed information, and he makes a very compelling argument for there being known knowledge that is underreported. And when it comes to the afterlife and Gnosticism, I'm agnostic to a lot of these things. Gnosticism to me sounds a lot like chaos magic, if you're familiar with chaos magic.
Oh yeah, it sounds like 11-year-old boys having fantasies about the world not wanting to grow up. Again, pillar saints and boy pharaohs.
I feel like he's using Gnosticism as a noble lie. So he's not using a theory of forms, but he's trying to marshal and usher people in a way that he believes will be speaking their language, right? So Lev once showed me a persuasion video called Speak to People's Elephants. And so if you imagine people as sitting on a giant elephant, like if you're trying to speak to the person on top of the elephant to persuade them, they're not going to go where you suggest, right? Because the elephant is really who's in charge. So you have to not speak to the person, you have to speak to the elephant that they're riding on. And so I thought that Giorgiani was doing that with Gnosticism, not necessarily that he believes it, but that he's pessimistic that people he needs to take him seriously won't unless he speaks their language.
Okay, and he's arguing with me quite a lot. So, no, I don't think so at all. And that's exactly why he ends up with these blood theories at the end of the day. This is typically Gnostic. I mean, Hitler was a Gnostic. Khomeini was a Gnostic, and he's kind of a fan of Khomeini, and I'm not. I'm totally opposed to the mullahs in Iran. And the problem here is that's why it ends up with theories like the Iranian blood is superior to the Turk and the Mongol blood, and modern Iranians have been corrupted because they've been fucking around with the Turks and the Mongols for too long. And these kind of really purely racist theories that he throws at you at the end of the day are only possible because he actually has a Gnostic conviction. I agree with many things Giorgiani writes about. I think he's excellent in exposing the origin of Islam. And I agree with him on that. And he's done tremendous work as an historian. But you got to keep a perspective to why he writes the way he does and what he wants to get at. And I don't work through a cynical manipulation of the reader. I really, really want to be as frank and honest as possible with the readers and be in dialogue with them. And I think it's the only way forward. If Giorgiani has another take on that and has other ambitions, then probably be successful. I think we will have a lot of sort of Iranian, Aryan, Renaissance nationalists running all over the place today, the mullahs fall. I don't think Iran will be peaceful for the following 50 years. I think it will be bloody and messy like hell. But I still want that to happen. Giorgiani agrees that we believe in the Iranian Renaissance, and we think it's absolutely essential for world history. We think the Iranian Renaissance is the only way for the East and West to finally start communicating with each other and discover the depth of human history. It's the only way for that to happen. And we agree that we want the mullahs to fall in that sense. But his Iranian nationalism is a racist form of nationalism. My Iranian nationalism is a rediscovery of the Zoroastrianism, the Zoroastrian Renaissance. The Zoroastrianism is an adamant universal religion. Actually, the whole idea of universal religion where all human beings are equal is a Zoroastrian idea. And that's where I'm at.
Are you familiar with Hotep philosophy or Hotep theology? I've been wading into some Hotep circles and listening to some of their theories and analyses. There's a guy that I'm a big fan of, Hotep Jesus. He's been on InfoWars, he's been on Joe Rogan. He has a small channel, and he recently had someone on called Young Pharaoh. He goes by Young Pharaoh, and they were saying that, I mean, it's a preposterous. I'm not sure how tongue-in-cheek theory, but they were saying that they believe white people can't help from conquering things. But they also said that Arabs were white. So they have a theory that... so
it's fun, yeah. I made a series of lectures in 2012, 8 years ago, called The Golden Age of Sects and Cults. And I'm not surprised you guys are following Hotep and you're following Giorgiani and all these guys, because what you do now, you live in a completely mythical realm where you're interested in mythos, you're interested in storytelling. And the faster where it gets, the more interesting it gets. We're going to have Dune coming back, this amazing science fiction fantasy. It's going to come back now on the big screen or whatever. And yeah, it probably is going to be really good too. It's a good director. So, and I think with Dune, you're going to have a massive amount of mythical narrative that appeals to young men, especially. And I think your generation, you're going to jump onto that. What I try to do, though, is to stay clear and in touch with reality and get back to the logos and do proper philosophical work and work with physicists and other natural scientists to get their shit right, too. I am more interested in that than the storytelling. I enjoy the Netflix series and I enjoy these guys having these funny conversations about African heritage or whatever. But these race theories, I think, are not only dangerous, they're also wrong.
Yeah.
I don't think race exists at all. I think it's made up. I think human beings were all the same until about 10,000 years ago. And then some lazy fat woman sat down in somewhere in Babylonia, and the other guys followed her and sat down too. And because they written language, they could create something called civilization. I'm not sure that was a good thing in the first place, but now we're stuck with it. And we built technology on top of that. And that's what I find interesting with civilization. Civilization did not improve human beings in any way whatsoever. It made us worse, but it improved technology. And I think one day technology will take over, and then technology will decide whether it wants us to be around or not. That's where we're headed.
One quick question before we get to our great guest Sophia and Bones is, what do you think of something like Göbekli Tepe that people like Graham Hancock attribute to showing certain constellations, as well as constellation patterns that could be possibly inferred from the pyramids, from the Sphinx being right in the center of the during the equinox of a certain star alignment? So all these things, or the Mayan calendar, to me at least, they talk about time being a very important factor for a lot of these civilizations, and not a short amount of time, but the precession of the equinoxes, that's 26,000 years. For somebody to care that much about that amount of time. And one final thing that I will add to it, if you look at the Temple of Luxor, it's a very man-shaped temple as far as it corresponds to the human body. And that to me is also why I brought up the whole human body as a universe, at least the way that they looked at the world. It's romantic, but it's still fascinating to me. All these different things.
we try to find metaphors and analogies in everything we watch as human beings, and that makes sense, and often it's a great thing. It's called scales. Nassim Taleb is writing a book about it at the moment, and I work with scales all the time. And yes, things can look very similar, and why wouldn't nature operate in a similar way on the smaller scale that it does on the larger scale? But it doesn't mean automatically you can take something you've discovered on the larger scale and then try to force it onto the smaller scale, and it still makes sense. But you said something really interesting. The book we're working on, the follow-up to Digital Libido, is called Process and Event, right? And it's going to be the big work that we do. And in this book, we're going to claim that process philosophy is the original philosophy, and that we live along the time axis, the original way of looking at the world, because the original nomadic way of life, the nomadology, was all about a circular time. It was all about time. And then the arrival of linear time that starts with the Zoroastrians and eventology is that along the time axis, certain events can happen that dramatically change history. And then human beings started believing that we changed as humans, we become different, we become more noble than the previous generations. And even up to Nietzsche, that is a dominant idea. That's the idea that Söderqvist and I are killing. We killed that idea completely and said, we have no historical records whatsoever to prove that our heads are any bigger than they were 200,000 years ago. Our brains are actually smaller, and we use less than we did 10,000 years ago. When we were nomadic, we had to use the brain all the time. Now we're so lazy, and we watch Netflix series, and we become couch potatoes, and we got in the streets and said, I want more money from the state because I'm not going to work any longer, but that's going to kill us completely. The one thing the machines will sweep away once the machine comes is people who get a citizen salary or something like that, universal basic income, and don't work at all. It's just like, what would you have those people for? So I would say you go back and look at the process and event. That's why the book is going to be called Process and Event. Those are the two major narratives we have about ourselves. And it's the eventology that later becomes things like Christianity and Islam that is recent. And the original story is about process and time. And Egypt was probably torn between these two, just like Persia were, and would eventually, when you arrived at Persia and Egypt becoming different cultures, and India and China became different cultures, they had these divisions. There was process, nomadology there. Hinduism is definitely nomadological, but there was also event-oriented philosophies as well, like Zoroastrianism, where things can happen. I would call them technological. So I would say that all the revolutions in human history are technological by nature. And when we make our own revolutions as human beings, it's only symptoms of a previous technological revolution. The printing press in 1450 is the revolution. Paris 1789 is just the result of that revolution. So it's the technological revolutions that I'm interested in. Those are the proper events of history.
Excellent. I would like to bring things up to our guests right now. So we have Sophia, we have Bones, and we have Mumbaji. I believe, Mumbaji, you have to leave sooner than everybody else. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, so Mumbaji, let's hear your question or comment for Alexander.
Well, it's not relevant to the conversation at all, but I was curious, like, how it is to work with Swedish state media. Like TV4 and censorship.
Oh, I just left TV4. I
I
was,
know, I know, I
I
know,
was
I know.
kind of fired
Yeah.
from Sweden's Got Talent.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
the Simon Cowell of Scandinavia.
Yeah.
What happened was that a bureau of some kind in Los Angeles started chasing American media companies. And you know what America's like these days. Just like anybody's made any mistake anywhere in the past or said anything that anybody could be offended by, it should be fired and killed instantly. It's just like the Jacobins are back, right? And what happened was that I wasn't gonna stay with the show anyway. I'm basically leaving television because television is dead. When I do my YouTube shows, I get more views than I have on any television show. So it's just ironic that I stayed on the show for as long as I did. It's just like the weirdest thing. I even wore chicken costumes the last season to show that side to television. But I was doing the show at least last year, and me and some other guys from the show are just leaving it. We just decided to leave because Fremantle, which is an American media company, got hysterical about an ironic tweet that I wrote on Twitter. And it was just went balloons, just went international, and people went hysterical about it. And it turned out that I think that 14 other men who were male TV show stars in America too were fired the same week from similar media companies because they were all pressured to fire these guys because they had sent nude pictures of somebody 14 years ago. You know, totally idiotic things. Just like it's gone completely ballistic and horrible, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But our societies today are basically controlled by Rousseauian lynch mobs that think that their feelings are more important than facts, and they're 23 years old and they got an Instagram account and they think they should rule the world. And I think it's terrible what's going on, and I think it's going to be really, really messy before we finally wake up and realize that we need to defend free speech adamantly. And the platforming and cancel culture are probably two worst hashtags ever invented. Worse than Nazism to me. We just need to get those things out of the way. But that's what happened here in Sweden. And it was kind of fascinating to just sit on the side and still be pulled into it, like some kind of projection space. What I did though was that I sat down with Navid Modiri and did a YouTube discussion in Swedish. We talked for 2 hours and we got 500,000 views within a couple of days. And that's what all the Swedes were watching. Well, I just explained why I tweet the way I do and explained, like you explain to children, this is how it operates. And that sort of settled the score here. Does that make sense? Television is dead. Newspapers are dead. Get out of old media completely. Let's move online and stay online. And since everything else becoming digitalized in the world today, we might as well move media to the digital realm completely. Then the digital realm has to mature. But we basically want to leave the new underclass, the new digital underclass in echo chambers where you only hear what you want to hear. And the rest of us are going to go for something that I now aggressively call antagony. Antagony means you desire to be challenged because only by being challenged can you become more intelligent. And even the smallest life forms know that.
Benjamin Franklin said that. Benjamin Franklin said that the more you fight, the smarter you become.
Yes, and I call it antagony. So be separated from antagonism. I'm not antagonistic with you guys. I want to be antagonic. I want to be challenged. I want you to challenge me, and I would love to challenge you guys so you become more intelligent, because you got to have a new stupid digital underclass who all stay in their echo chambers and try to find some abject out there, usually white heterosexual men they can yell at, or in Georgiani's case, he's a Turk or a Mongol. So you find somebody you can yell at and blame everything on him, and therefore you can live in your world of fantasies and try to stay there. But that's how you become a loser historically. And that's what we talk about the digital upper class and underclass today. With the upper class are looking for antagony all the time to become more intelligent. So which is the opposite of deplatforming.
We also have a comment from such a one, the great meme master, Devas and the Suras in Zoroastrianism versus Hinduism, please.
Okay, that's part of the folk religion aspect of Zoroastrianism, which I study less. But why Zoroastrianism is the origin of universal human rights is because it's a religion that says we should have different religions for different purposes. That's why I have Mithraism as a military cult. And you separate that from Zoroastrianism as a priestly cult, because you must, in Zoroastrianism, always separate the priest from the chieftain. That's exactly why the birth of democracy is the separation of the phallus. The priest, the Mobed and Mobed, has his own court, his own capital. The Shah and Shah, the king of the kings, has his own capital, his own court. They must never meet. They must never be part of the same system. And by separating the phallus, you can also then separate on different levels. So this is, of course, where Deleuze's philosophy of difference and repetition starts. what you then have when you separate the phallus, you separate priest and you separate a chieftain from each other, is that you can then separate other things too. You can, for example, allow a matriarchy to prosper, where older women guide younger women towards what it means to be a woman. Then you have basically the American Constitution. It consists of exactly those three roles. It has a president supposed to be chieftain. It has a Congress supposed to be the priest because they dictate the law. And then you have somebody holding the other two guys responsible for shaping up and delivering. And it's called the Supreme Court. It's a Persian structure that the French brought to America, and it's genius. That's how you build a strong society. So I would say that's where it starts. But then you can also have a folk religion. You can have an elite religion, which is like, okay, we're going to mysticism and we're going to deep studies, and it's going to take you 50 years to understand how the world actually operates. And then you get ideas like Zoroastrianism, you get ideas like Zoroastrianism. But below that, you can have a folk religion. And that's what in Catholicism is called saints. And this is what's called the lesser gods in Hinduism. Nobody with the same mind goes and worships God as an abstract concept. No, you go and worship Madonna if you're gay, whatever. You go and worship Michael Jackson if you're a pedophile. And you go worship Elvis Presley if you're just a regular American guy, right? So you go and worship these gods and you talk to them, and they can then talk to God. And this worship of lesser gods is actually quite beautiful, and that's called polytheism, but it existed in any decent religion. The problem with Protestantism was that it tried to remove these lesser gods so that I can sit and read a book alone called the Bible, and I could then talk directly to God. And that is, of course, the beginning of Instagram. It's like when everybody else hates me and thinks I'm crap and I'm not interesting at all, at least God will give me a like.
Well, they also
that is the promise you get in Protestant churches, like God loves you no matter what. No, he doesn't. He's bored with you like everybody else. He will fuck you, right? And this is exactly the problem we have with culture today.
Well,
we need the lesser gods back in.
In Islam, they did have, I remember Giorgiani wrote about this crazy guy who was like the village, I don't know what you would call it, just like the village crazy man, who was supposed to have like a special relationship with God, where because the dude was so crazy, God was actually making him crazy and saving him for himself, because he's crazy, but he's special. You know, like he has certain...
but that's not why he's crazy. The crazy man is crazy because then you can't mimic him. Because the problem with humanity, read René Girard, the problem with humanity is that we mimic all the time. Children mimic grown-ups, that's okay. But grown-ups also mimic other grown-ups. And because they have mimetic desires and they mimic even their desires, they eventually get, you get so much tension in society, you need to find a fucking scapegoat and get out of the problem. And this is what happens constantly in history. That's exactly how lynch mobs today. But digital lynch mobs today. And they're frustrated because they're under pressure, because they're very unhappy with their lives and they fail at what they do. And that's why they go after somebody else to deplatform them and cancel them. That's exactly what's happening today. When we're all told when the internet arrived, we were all going to be stars. We're all going to have 60 million followers. Every one of us is going to be that important and interesting. And at the end of the day, no, we only have a limited amount of time we're awake every day. And when we're awake, we then have to be online all the time, which Facebook thought we would be. And then we would all follow each other. No, we don't. We follow a few people that are actually interesting and provide some quality of some kind. So there are only a few winners in the internet world after all. And all these disappointed people with their Instagram accounts today who never became stars, who failed at the auditions and nobody cared because they just mimicked others. This is where we've ended up today. And that's exactly when people realize that the internet is not going to be my stage either. Everybody's on the stage. There's no audience left. It's a lack of audience that's dominant in the world today. And that's exactly why we get the lynch mobs. So to get out of that, you need, if you're going to be in any way decently spiritual, you need to have a crazy wisdom teacher, a crazy guy who you cannot mimic. He's such a fool. And what he does is such horrible and horrendous. But you can learn from him. And that's the only pure knowledge when you learn from somebody without mimicking. That's called Tantra in the East.
Very interesting.
And that's why the shaman is always crazy. He behaves as if he's crazy, even if he isn't. So the point here is that the shaman cannot be copied. And because you cannot mimic him, you have to make up your own mind and find your own way in life.
And those would also be the artists in the periphery, where I've always just seen that, let's say today, I mean, we have a Gay Pride month in Manhattan, for instance, and everything's become, at the same time, sanitized, but also all of this S&M stuff.
The gays have left. The gays have left. They're not in the parade any longer. It doesn't speak volumes. It's like we have a shamanic parade, but the shamans left. Okay, the point here is that I talk about the shamanic cast with Söderqvist in our books all the time. We celebrate it. And that's why Thaddeus Russell and I are spirits, the same spirit, kindred spirits. he is always defending the renegades. He wrote this amazing book called The Renegade History of the United States. And it's actually the best and most proper and honest history book on America ever. So what we're saying is that the shamans go forward and they're crazy and all that, but they're the only ones who do something genuinely original. That's why art belongs with the shamans, because they do original stuff. The rest of us are just mimickers.
So first of all, we got Varys here, and my buddy Dan is in the waiting room. He's waiting to get let in right now. And I just want to say, so you said people that worship pedophiles like Michael Jackson, is that why the Safdie brothers put Michael Jackson in a cross and Uncut Gems? Is it like a big
It's going to be interesting.
conspiracy,
It's going to be
or, like,
interesting.
what's
It's going to be interesting.
going
We finally have the Michael Jackson Renaissance, because the Michael Jackson Renaissance is we're going to be forced to revalue our values.
Michael Jackson was wrongfully
Embrace him
accused.
again.
Michael Jackson never did anything wrong. Michael Jackson never did anything wrong.
No, I mean, I'm not a moralist.
Huh?
So I don't think anybody does anything
Nobody's being
wrong
a
ever.
moralist here, yeah.
I don't know.
What I thought when you brought up Tantra, I thought that was really pertinent, because in my readings of Tantra and like the tradition, I've noticed that the model often given for tantric tradition in general is that there's two rivers that flow into that, and one is clerical and one is shamanic. And it's extremely pertinent to also like the neurotic versus the psychotic, this like split model of how different types of people work. And I think that it connects really nicely with what you've been talking about, because it's the same thing. It's this idea where you have larger societies, or like the more orthodox structure of society, and one person says, read this book, and then everyone reads this book, versus like the more organic, charismatic basis for spirituality that cannot be imitated, cannot be replicated. And that's why the internet right now is an extremely shamanic space. Like you see new holy men arising every day.
Mm-hmm.
It's
You're
a golden
brilliant.
age.
Where the fuck did you come from, Sophia? That's
From
brilliant.
the internet.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you're great. You're the next holy woman then in that case, or whatever holy gender you want to be. But yeah, you're brilliant. No, that's absolutely correct. What I do in my work, and this is exactly my work through the 4 Middle Eastern religions, because the problem with Islam and Christianity is that they removed something that I call the Bard Absolute. It's nothing to do with me. It's not B-A-R-D. It's B-A-R-R-E-D. So it's like Bard. It's barred from us. It's closed from us. We can't have access to it. And the idea with the Bard Absolute is that we go and pray to the lesser gods, and this is called Sutra. And this is like how the world works. So you're going to run village life, and you're going to run it properly and fairly. You teach Sutra. But then if you want to go beyond that, to the Zoroastrian world, you cross the Shinavad bridge. You go into the realm of the dead and the not yet born. What they meant with that is you go into a realm that most people will not go to. And you have to have a certain personality type to have access to it. And you have to study first before you're ready for it.
That is only accessible to a special caste.
Exactly. So it's Tantra. This is the Bard. And I want to reintroduce the Bard Absolute, which Zoroastrianism and Judaism saved. It's impossible for a Jew or for a Zoroastrian to talk directly to God. You talk to the priest, and the priest then talk to God on your behalf. And for most people, that's how most people operate. But the idea in Protestantism, you have direct access to God, or the idea in, say, Islamism, for example, that God has direct access to you, which is just as ridiculous. There has to be something in between, because there has to be, for us, a possibility to be children before we become grown-ups. And when we're grown-ups, we have masters, and we learn from the masters how to do, for example, professions. And that's how most human activities should be. That's called Sutra. But to go into the Tantric realm is only for some people to do. And they usually have to be incredibly independent, because they probably had to go out somewhere in the forest, in the woods, and be out there on their own with a few other outcasts, weirdos. And that's where they go. And then when you look, say, Thaddeus Russell's description of America, and you look at the urban environment, it's always in the harbors where you find the red light districts, where all the hustlers go. That's where you find the shamanic caste people, or his renegades. That's where you find them. They will always look for that realm. And that's exactly what the internet is dominated by mass behavior, mimicking and all that. That's the vast majority of it. But for us, we just look for these other weirdos out there, and we finally find them. And this is what I call the digital shamans. I think, or the digital priesthood. The shamanic caste will now reunite because of the internet on a global scale, hopefully through English as their shared language. And they will then exchange their information with each other. And they go into the mythic realm and do these crazy shit guys that Lev and Jules are hooked on, like most guys their generation are. It's called mythos. And we'll then also rediscover logos, which is like the ultimate reality. which is, of course, the proper mystical journey. That's not into fairy tales, but actually the opposite direction towards logos. Like, what is the ultimate reality? What is it like? And can I have access to it? And am I prepared to live with it no matter what if I'm approached by it?
Well, at that point, it's too late. Either you live with it or you're destroyed by it.
Well, you can just have the psyche to survive it.
Yes.
But you probably...
But that is only granted to a specific group.
Yes, and you probably have to live with the acknowledgement that I wish I'd never experienced it. I was a bit too curious, but still I did. And I'm proud of the fact that I did. And I'm proud of the archetype that I represent, that I did that. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to be a priest and sit and listen to confessions all day long, you better have lived a full life. You better understand the richness of life and the horrors of it. Because otherwise, nobody will believe you when you sit there. But when they realize you're empathic towards the others, not empathic in a sentimental sense, but empathic is like, yeah, I get where you're at. I haven't been there for 12 years like you and lived that kind of hell, but I've been there. I've taken a drug. I had a bad trip. And I was there for 8 hours and I wanted to kill myself too. So I have some kind of gnosis, some kind of knowledge of where you're at. And that's exactly why I can empathize with you.
You know, it's interesting you guys talk about this. And I know Sophia, is it?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
You mentioned something special about religion that gives them their power. And that made me think of a book I'm reading by William James called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he kind of posits that it's the individual religious experience and a deep sense of clarity that sort of makes people by and large religious, or listen to people who have had similar experiences. And he has this amazing catalog of different people, some who I can recognize, like say St. Augustine or you know, St. Aquinas, stuff like that. But I think that's an interesting thing to consider, because you know, there's so much to be said. Like, is it actually a religious experience? And am I being touched by God, or is it something more like a mania? Or are these shamans you know, under the influence, or are they actually being touched? And in any case, I think what he basically says is that it doesn't really matter, because it still enforces a change in the individual. And I think that's what a lot of religion is about like creating change in the individual. If you led a life of debauchery or whatever, you know, drinking all the time, and then one day one particular passage from the Bible, you know, flashes in.
I would stop you there, because I think you're mistaking one thing for the other. It's absolutely religious experience. This is a shamanic religious experience you're talking about. I think Sophia would agree with me. And that's where you did psychedelics. That was the original religion as a practice on your own. But that's how shamans practice religion.
I'm not discounting that.
Yeah, but the change in your character through religious experience is not part of that at all. That's too Christian. That arises way later when you have a controlled society.
It is about, the book is mainly involved in Christianity.
Yeah, and
if you read Rudolf Otto later in the 1910s, that's Heilige. That book kickstarted 20th century anthropology, which is a fantastic area. That's where guys like Jordan Peterson, Camille Page come out of that scene too. But that's much later. Out of Rudolf Otto came Mircea Eliade, and he wrote a book called Shamanism in the 1950s. And while we talk about shamanism today, we talk about the shamanic caste and shamans as people who go and pursue their religious experience in the forest or in the deserts, is because of Mircea Eliade. And he essentially says that this is also the original religious experience. But religion is then also the organization of society as a whole. And religion then, to me, is ultimately how the elders of society control the youth and then get them into what they should do. If you say you go to Cameroon in Africa and you witness an Iboga ceremony, which is like 3 days of hell and eventually heaven, and you get your ego knocked out to have your ego serve the community, which you do basically with young brats. You put them through the Iboga ceremony. That's how we use it today to get rid of the opiate addiction, because that's also a narcissistic problem. So you knock the narcissism out and finally have a person ready to serve the community, which is the point for a young man, for example. And that's why these strong psychedelic experiences are then brought into the community, but they're brought in by the elders who lovingly teach the young to serve the community and not serve their own egos. And that is where it touches the event that changes you forever.
Yeah.
But for the shaman, it's just having an experience that they never had before, and just being more, have a bigger memory of what life is. It's not about becoming a good person or anything like that at all.
Yes, I would love to be able to bounce off of this. I think that there's like a really big disjunct between like the concept of becoming, which is predominant in the more clerical point of view, which is like the mainstream Christianity. And then you can see the idea of being, the idea that you really never change. You just become more aware of yourself. You don't change as a person. When you take a shaman is a special type of person. The shaman can be identifiable as a child. The shaman will go through a cathartic experience in young adulthood typically, but it can occur even later in life. But the shaman is the shaman because he's the shaman. There's no qualifying experience that he goes through, and you don't graduate into shamanism. You always were. You were selected way before birth. The concept of time is irrelevant to the heterodox practice of spirituality because it has everything to do with time, and that's why it's hard to explain. I'm sure you could be a lot more eloquent about it, but because it is time linked, it is immutable, or like it is one with the concept of time and of change. It is fatalistic in an absolute sense.
That sounds a lot like the caste system too, in India and elsewhere, is that people are born into certain roles in life and that they can spend their whole life trying to get to the next rung, but they will never be, Well,
the idea of going to the next rung is again a orthodox concept that is it very much is linked to like the more like the mainstream Hindu doctrine of there is one caste that is better than the other, but realistically speaking, all the castes are supposed to work together. And when you look at, for instance, the role of tantric tradition in India, it is often like predilect of the lower castes, because it is a system of technology that does not serve one caste over the other. It is something that selects its chosen people regardless of the caste to which they belong.
Yeah.
You can be
the caste
born...
system is within Sutra, and Tantra is beyond the caste system.
Exactly.
Like it is beyond good and evil, the same thing. And you're absolutely right, Sophia. The shamans live in a world where they can be a child, they can be a god, they can be a grown-up at any given time. They don't go through these phases that the rest of us are forced to do. So they're beyond that. So they live in a state of, I wouldn't say it's beyond time in the traditional sense, but it's because it's a circular world. They can live outside of it and imagine what it's like to be outside of it.
There's a question I wanted to ask to everyone, but also specifically, I'm curious what Sophia and what Alexander think of this. So when we were talking before about us going into the stage of these Wall-E people where we're constantly just being drugged up and just getting entertainment, and to me, that's more of a sign of devolution than evolution. But what's also interesting for me is the idea of there being certain, let's say, powers, for lack of a better word, that people possessed before, and that there are some records, I don't know if these are false or not, of, let's say, certain tribesmen talking about how they would listen to their heart and they would know whether a tribe that went hunting is going to bring back food to them, so they would either prepare a ceremony or not. And I've always been fascinated about what these things are, just as I've been fascinated about the dream state, Kundalini, which I've also been experiencing, just all of these things that people would apply the word supernatural to. But I'm curious where what your take is on a lot of these experiences people would call supernatural. And that's pretty much it.
Well, I don't allow anything supernatural in my philosophy at all, because everything is connected with everything else. So it's within the same nature. And culture is just our human version of adding something to that nature. It's still natural. So no, it doesn't make any sense to use the word. It's always people who want to escape life. It's always when people go into this mode where they want to escape reality and get away from it and start to mistake mythos for being logos instead of separating mythos and logos. That's where you get these problems. No, if people have capacities like that, then study them for God's sake and try to figure out how they got them. Intuition is fantastically interesting, how it actually operates. But people becoming smarter by having access to less information, meaning there's a certain creativity going on that compensates more than well for the information lost. So all those things are worthy of study, but I don't think it makes any sense to say that there's the natural and then on top of that, the supernatural. I can become a little wizard and become Harry Potter because I can do little tricks. I think actually it's the opposite now. I think we are finally moving out of an age of the religion of magic, moving into nature, the religion of technology. This is the whole thesis of the Syntheism book, is that we are finally now realizing that magic was only there to inspire us to create a technology in the future. What was called, telepathy in the past, was dreamed about, became the smartphone today. And for good or bad, we now have smartphones, and we're going to have them for the rest of existence. That is an event in itself. So after the smartphone arrived, we're going to have to live with smartphones. But that changes the conditions of what it means to be human, because our environment has then radically changed. And that's what I'm interested in. I think we're going to build God. God is not something that created us. God is just the word for the ultimate dream of what we want to build. And in any engineer I talk to say the ultimate dream for an engineer is to build a temple skyscraper or something like that. To be like something that is a temple and reaches to the sky properly. Should be 3 kilometers high and in gold, right? Something like that. That'd be the ultimate engineering construction. And I find that really interesting. I find that ultimately we want to build temples and we want to build God. And that's why I'm interested in the God concept that I put in the future as technology achieved dream.
Well, you're absolutely right that supernatural is not a good word to use here for all these various reasons. But what I'm interested in, though, is this ability to do something that is far beyond our current comprehension. Like I mentioned in that example with the tribe being able to know whether or not the hunting party has succeeded. So if we push that to its limits, how far can we go? That's what I'm interested in.
I'd love
but
to
isn't
try
that like a
answering
spooky?
that.
That's like a spooky action at a distance. So, like a theory for how that would work is a biological tethering, like a quantum entanglement, which Einstein demonstrated. He coined the term spooky action at a distance. So I've always had a problem with the term supernatural because there's always things outside of our explanation. You can be a caveman making a spear.
Nature is spooky enough anyway, so let's just stay with that.
Have you ever been in the
if you
woods
can't
at
explain
night?
a lightning bolt, is a lightning bolt supernatural just because it's outside of your understanding or explanation? Of course not.
Well, Sophia, you were going to say something, and I'm curious what it was.
Well, I wanted to first say that, I wanted to agree with Alexander about the idea of supernatural. It's implying that we know what is natural and we can differentiate it from the supernatural. I think that the abilities and what we call magic is inherent to who we are as people. When you experience something spectacular, it is natural to you. Again, like the concept, when you look at the shamanic frame for any kind of phenomenon, it's always been there. It is natural. It is as supernatural as drinking water. It is as supernatural as waking up from a nap and looking at the clouds. It's why divination, practically applied, can be used in any circumstance, and you don't need a tarot deck or I Ching set. This is just like part of your experience as a person. And I think that in terms of like what age we're living through the natural progression and collapse of the Orthodox system, in a sense that, not that it's going to collapse permanently, everything is cyclical, but it has ballooned to a certain size. And when you look at the burning of the Notre Dame Cathedral, I think that that's a pretty significant omen for what's happening. And when you have the cathedral of your city burning down, people will flee to the periphery and they'll go back to the old lady who, has a kind of weird look in her eye, but she has a good connection to God and she can give you advice. And that's what we're seeing happening today. That's already what's happening. More and more people, are turning off the TV, picking up their phone and looking on social media. More and more people are disregarding the notion of authority, and they're taking to the streets to have fun with their friends. It's not even about a political statement. It's about connecting with other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. They are. And we call this plurarchy. So to differentiate it from anarchy and not be too afraid of it, but actually see it developing. And plurarchy, essentially, bad word, but we use that one. Plurarchy essentially state where you get nodes. So you get certain people that the people attend to. And these nodes, these personal nodes, tend to be shamanic by character in history. That's where you build from, because the shamans look through whatever else is happening and can then tell you the truth in that case. So the elders, matriarchs, patriarchs, and the shamans are the ones you turn to when the Notre Dame burns down.
Absolutely.
So we also have Bones, who I don't know how long you're going to be able to stay, but you had a question or comment for Alexander. And everyone subscribe right now. Who's watching this, subscribe right now.
Does my mic work?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is not...
It's a little bit quiet, though. It's a little bit quiet.
That's because my voice is a bit messed up.
No, you have a
I
good
did
voice.
something. No, I mean I heard my voice.
Oh, okay.
So what I wanted to ask is, this is something a bit unrelated. Is I know you have worked with music, Alexander, for some time now, and I want to ask you how the music industry has changed in your time, because you talked earlier about the decline of old media and the rise of digital media. Can you translate that over to the music industry as well?
Yeah, I was probably the only person who worked with Spotify, although I was still a music industry director. But that's sort of 2005 we saw that change.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to do when I worked with Spotify was to create new streams of revenue for musicians by basically looking at streaming as what could save the music industry. And I think it has. It has changed, though, in the sense that the music industry used to be a dominant culture when it came to ideas. We go back to the 1960s with Bob Dylan and, Black empowerment and all kinds of things that happened. They all happened through pop culture. But I think pop culture has lost that role completely. It's not leading the way forward anyway. It's completely commercialized. But also, it was one of the ideas when I worked with Spotify was that we knew that this would change the way people consume music and the playlist would become more important. And I didn't mind the playlist dominating the music industry because the playlist is a tribal phenomenon. It's algorithmic and tribal, meaning that I create a playlist of music that I love, and the music that I love to listen to again and again that I actually favor because I think is the quality among the music out there, is then recommended to friends, and I make friends even through the algorithm because I make friends with people who share my musical taste.
Yeah.
And this creates a democratic environment, but anybody could put their music out there without the music industry standing in the way, without television advertising your music. It's just accessible in there. And if a few people start listening to music and they like it and they go back to it, it will be recommended and its audience will grow and grow and grow. So this is the playlist have democratized music, but the playlist also removed the star culture, which the music industry was built on. So the music industry was essentially like, we're going to find a talent somewhere out there, a spooky shamanic personality, hopefully, some with a weird life and a weird look. And then we're going to put them on a stage and they're going to be idolized. So they're going to be lesser gods, and then people can worship them and buy the records. And then we're going to keep the career alive for as long as possible, usually with opiates or something, so they can still go back onto that stage and create the same kind of music and create a subculture around themselves. That's what the music industry used to make money. I think today, you have to be more humble when you're a musician today. If you love making music, you're there to serve now. Yeah. You're serving other people. That's why the DJ became the new rock star. And we had this phenomenon starting in Sweden, my friends, the Swedish house mafia, and we had these guys who became like huge stars around the Avicii, for example. These guys came out of Scandinavia, the same thing that happened in North America, but the DJ became the star. But the DJ never dressed up like a rock star. The DJ would have jeans and t-shirt. Why? Because he was basically not comfortable being the rock star. He was serving you, because you and your friends, your tribe on the dance floor were now the stars. And this is what music does today. To me, music is like what Brian Eno once wisely said: if you could just kill the rock star and get the rock star out of the way, music can become what it should be, which is a sonic wallpaper.
We also see this manufacturing of, once you get in the music industry, a formula that's successful, they replicate it until it dies.
Yes.
And it kind of devalues the original message, I would say, of the originator's intent.
I give you an example of how scary that can be, though. For example, that hip hop has inspired me tremendously over the last 30 years. It's been the dominant mode of innovation in the music industry. It is now so flat and commercialized, unless it's Kanye West madness, that it has no value any longer. It's completely commercialized and flat. And I think I would watch out now after Black Lives Matter in North America. I would expect white power music that, again, music comes back to the point where it's all about making your mom upset. And I'm terrified of that power being completely now obsolete. The music industry is trying to kiss the ass of the parents. The music industry trying to make music that the parents will like and approve of.
So we have,
and I think that creates a new pressure again to actually go for something that is sexy because it's dangerous and your mom gets upset by it. And that could go anywhere. It could go into white power or something like that as well, being the new rock and roll.
Yeah. I would say the industry has looped back to the 80s with the parental labeling on albums back like
I think it's the 1950s. I think it's before Elvis Presley. I think it's actually incredibly easy to be shocking today. And whoever picks up on that, it becomes shocking, becomes the next star. And then maybe star power is back in the music industry.
true.
But right now, I don't mind it being sonic wallpaper. I prefer if we could stay there. Because if you and I we discover we share musical taste and we can add to each other's algorithms, it's also only fair because the best music is the music that comes forward because of it. But I'm terrified of the fact that the music industry could still underrate the fact that young people are looking for identity and look for identity in shock value again. And I think the political correctness that dominates the mode at the moment will only prepare for that next dialectical turn to happen. And I have no idea which direction it will go that time, because anybody could put the music out there and start a record company from anywhere. It's anarchic and could be fun, but it could also be terrible.
Are you also noticing, though, that in the music today, certain things like drug use, for example, like the purple drink or whatever other things kids like to use to get high, like drug use and sex, that's something that's promoted. It's not really something that I see as being looked down upon by the music industry as a whole. So it's not exactly 1950s in that sense, is it? It's slightly different.
No, that's because sex and drugs aren't shocking any longer.
Exactly.
I told you, it's all about upsetting your mom, and your mom will get upset when you say the N-word or something like that.
There are plenty of
that
ways
creates that tension, right?
There are plenty of ways to be shocking in like how you make music as well, not just in the lyrics or in the content of the lyrics and what your subject matter is, or even, like I think with the rise of YouTube, it's been easier than ever to get into like all these different undergrounds of musical sounds and everything that are both wallpaper and also like immersive and like Y, like Yoni Wolf and Pile, like just to name two. There's all these different bands out there and there's new bands all the time and new sounds all the time, and I think it's becoming less about angering your mother necessarily and more for like this sort of wellspring that's like deep underground for all these bands. It's becoming like the new sounds they use, like Yoni Wolf and Y uses like kitten noises and like like maybe like a dropping
I was
glass on the floor or something like that, and it's there's just so much. It's a wealth. It's like there's a wealth of different music out there.
I mean, that just seems like more the
but
concept
it's
of modern
definitely
art
still
than...
it's
Yeah, to me,
it's definitely
it's like industrial. It's like industrial metal. It did the same thing. I don't know how many decades ago of getting creative with the
90s.
instruments. Okay, there you go. Before my time, let's put it that way. But the idea of using new sounds isn't necessarily the same as the sociological role that music can play. I think that there's like an immense opportunity for like creative, like new methods. But just because you come up with a new method or a new sound doesn't mean that your music is going to be appealing or controversial. Like OK Go is an incredibly unique band, I would say, for like the music videos that they've put out. They're just, all of them are extremely interesting and definitely like what I would describe as creative. But I wouldn't say that that was appealing, because you still have to consider, I think Alexander's quite right, the shock value is relevant. That's why that's why cancel culture is a double-edged sword, because what people do, and this is something I've seen on Tumblr in the past decade, whenever someone makes a post where they're calling out a user, or they're making a post where they're calling out a whole list of users saying, please block all of these to stay safe, you'll immediately have a smaller group of people saying, okay, I'm following all of these people. Thank you for the notification.
Yep.
So, yeah, those are two different phenomena, I think. Like the perfection of art and like the development of art with new methods and instruments is one thing. And then you have like this social element of like orthodoxy versus heterodoxy. It has its own contention.
Yeah,
I would say also like the examples you are giving are also the fact that like we're all a bit older now, but like from my experience, there's still artists like Blady is very much a is one of those like controversial artists, and also like the kids like TK or like all these rappers that are like actually dangerous, like 50, like most of rap is like showy. Now there's like actual like kind of like black metal, where there's people who are actually going to go do it. There's similar like subgenres of like rap and of like industrial or techno, whatever. They're similarly pushing the boundaries that way. There's always going to be something controversial, and like it's just that we're older and we don't look for it.
By the way, Verse, there was a problem with your audio. I recommend calling back on the cell phone if possible.
Is it going weird again? Okay.
Yeah, it's going like we're very strangely right now.
But don't
Like a
worry,
robot.
Verse.
Like a
You look
robot.
so great, so it compensates for the sound quality. So don't worry
Thank
about
you.
it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No.
Also, there was an article from Smithsonian Magazine, 2012. Science proves pop music has actually gotten worse. So they talk about the timbral variety going down. And I'm curious, Alexander, what you think about that?
Okay, I gave up making music 6 years ago because I did want to focus on the philosophy eventually, and I had my success. And I remember the day when I opened my Spotify account and there were over 18 million songs in there. And I just asked myself, honestly, does the world really need one more Alexander Bard song? No. Does it need more Alexander Bard books? Probably more likely. So I go for the books full time. But I gave up with a smile and enjoyed it a lot. And I had a terrific time the 25 years plus that I worked in the music industry. I really enjoyed every second of it.
I have another like sort of question regarding that, or like a guy that I follow a lot, a guy called Burden Christopher Bell, who's also a guy who's been making music for a long time. He talked about the rise of Spotify and the availability of music as a negative thing, because the easier you have access to all this music, the less valuable it becomes.
Well, I think that's the internet in general, and it's kind of an anti-internet statement. At the end of the day, it's not the availability that's going to cause any problems for you psychologically or whatever. What it means is that you need somebody to give you order to the chaos.
Yeah,
that's what algorithms are for. So the response to that is to the guys, have you discovered algorithms yet? Because algorithms actually limit. From all this case, they limit and give you an order of what you're going to appreciate and what you're going to grow with. And actually the algorithms, at least if they're free and open, if you look for challenging material all the time, you want to be challenged. If you look for the antagonist, you're going to get smarter because you're going to get better algorithm. I think of algorithms as a kind of guardian angels. And I think they should be sacred and holy. And I don't think commercialism should be allowed to corrupt algorithms, and I don't think politics should be allowed to manipulate algorithms. I think we're going to have eventually, I think what started with the pirate movement here in Europe 20 years ago, and eventually it's the hackers movement today, is eventually going to be a movement towards the free and open algorithm. And we're not going to fight about protecting our data. We're going to fight for algorithms that we and our friends can have for ourselves without corruption and manipulation. I think that ultimately that's where Silicon Valley is going to fall, because their algorithms are already way too corrupt and way too manipulated. And we're eventually going to look for algorithms that we can create ourselves that are more free and open. And then the fact that 80 million songs there is not a problem any longer. It doesn't devalue the music at all, because I actually value the music through the algorithm. I value my friends. I value that we share taste. I value that we enjoy finding our own sonic wallpaper together. And that's where value is created.
Mm.
I would like
Otherwise, it's all about Louis Vuitton bags and you can't go to H&M. And that's just elitist to me. It's just like not making it available to people. And I think the fact that 20 million songs are available to me is a revolution itself that is fantastic.
I really love what you said about algorithms being guardian angels. And I'd love to add that guardian angels are arguably algorithms.
Yeah.
It goes both ways.
Yeah.
Especially those.
We had a ceremony here in our team. Peter and I work with. We just sat down one day and basically, did some drugs or whatever. And then we baptized our algorithms and called them Gabriel and Michael. So we work on our personal algorithms actively. We try to keep them as pure and as interesting as possible by looking at our own consumption and the media consumption of our friends. To keep them as interesting as possible and to challenge ourselves to go and watch documentaries and things that kind of are shocking to us, so we never thought that would happen. Because that's how you grow.
Signal noise.
About shocking people, you have seen that people still try to spout. Like you see people like Henry Rollins, the lead singer for some years of Black Flag. He still spouts the same talking points as he did back in 1980. And he still talks about it like it's still a what do you call it? Like it's still a new thing, even though it's he's been talking about the same stuff for 40 years. So he's no longer shocking. He's part of the mainstream.
Oh yeah, rock stars are
decent.
terrible when it comes to fashion. They become fashionable, and then they have their seasons when they're popular, and then they keep the same hairdo although they're 60 years old, and that's how pathetic rock stars are. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
Leave
Green
the
Day had to
past.
go on a 8-year break during the Obama presidency, and they were making dance music instead of punk rock, and now they're trying to get back to it, but I haven't heard of a Green Day album that's been relevant in a while.
In
I
Russia,
left the music industry before I turned 50 because I think it's time to leave. I think it's a youth business. And I think instead philosophy is something where you're still young when you're 59, which is kind of more fitting.
in Russia, it's even worse, by the way. We have like people like Philip Kirkorov, who's already kind of like a walking, like a walking zombie in a way. I mean, I'm sure he's a nice guy, but like they keep these Russian singers
I know
around.
him.
Oh boy. Okay. Well,
He's the biggest closet gay person on the planet for sure. So
Absolutely.
and the Russians just refuse to believe that he somehow has sex with whatever his wife was. But
Leontiev too. Leontiev too, right?
yeah, Russia is fantastic in that sense. Russia is the country where they pretend that they persecute gay people, although gay people are everywhere all the time.
That's true.
It's funny how like most of those countries where you would assume gays are the least welcome, that's where they gather the most, like Saudi Arabia and Russia. They gather
Yeah.
a lot there.
And by the way, we have Jared Janes here. Jared, thank you so much for coming in. I don't know how much of the dialogue you were following right now, but do you have any question, comment, anything you want to say?
Gosh, I don't know. I tried to catch up on some of the backlog and was coming in and thinking I was gonna say something about philosophy or something like that. I'm trying to bridge these two worlds now. Maybe Alexander, just kind of curious, especially as we're talking about art and the kind of multifaceted mixing and matching we have right now. The first thing that comes to mind for me is meta-modernism, and kind of approaching creation from these different kind of developmental stances, whether it's the kind of modern, pre-modern, or postmodern places. And I don't know. Love to hear your thoughts on it in general, and I'm sure you have some general thoughts on meta-modernism to begin with.
Yeah, I know the guys who created meta-modernism, and the problem I have, I'm kind of like the sour old man who kind of critiques what they're up to. Number one, why would meta-modernism be regarded as different from postmodernism to begin with? But as it achieved, the postmodernism didn't already do. And the problem is that there is no postmodernism. It's basically a made-up word afterwards, applied on a lot of different thinkers and artists who actually were never such a thing. I mean, Derrida was not a postmodernist. Foucault and Deleuze were not postmodernists. So postmodernism is more like a cultural movement where you sort of mixed and blended things and threw them together in a melange, and you try to play around with history in the 1980s. And then it became a bad word with Jordan Peterson and was thrown at people in the past for, not taking responsibility, being childish. I'd rather talk about infantilism. I'd rather talk about youth worship after 1945 rather than wisdom worship, and the shift, culturally unique in history, that we shifted from the worship of wisdom towards a worship of youth. And I think the sexualization that goes with that created the infantilization of societies we have it. And I think that's where the problems are at that Jordan Peterson is discussing, for example. I think we need to go much deeper than that. So I think meta-modernism could be interesting as a kind of movement, but any art exhibition I've been to so far that calls it meta-modernist is usually crappy postmodernist. It's great that people take on the word and label themselves and wear t-shirts called meta-modernism. I'm still waiting for it to happen, though.
Go
on.
And I guess from my perspective, and maybe this will even branch back to some of the things we were talking about before when you were kind of talking about mathematics and your kind of interpretation of it, is that if anything's below a certain, I think you said the Planck length, it's all chaos and it should be excluded from the system, right? This kind of the void or the womb, I feel like excluding it is making sure that your any kind of form that arises in your philosophy is always going to be some sort of coarse graining. And what I see as of the meta-modern shift is basically taking on the postmodern critique of saying chaos is always going to be in the system, and we can't have any kind of form that arises is going to be temporary and coarse grained, and yet we create no matter what, and we can use any of the modern, pre-modern, postmodern, whichever lens we want to make sure whatever.
But that is postmodernism. That is postmodernism.
Well, postmodernism
if
just
anything, that's what it
critique.
is. No, we can plunder history and throw things together and try to make something new out of it. That is postmodern. I still don't see philosophically where there's a shift towards something that's relevant with the new term called meta-modernism. I think the meta-modernists are trying to escape the fact that they don't have a clean break with postmodernism. They're just more of the same. I would rather say, no, I don't really do much. I think Bruno Latour's book, We Were Never Moderns, should be read by meta-modernists, because then you actually remove the whole sort of Ken Wilber hierarchy that we go towards something more advanced and meta-modernism more advanced than postmodernism. I don't think it is at all. I don't think human beings and our thinking gets any more advanced. When 23-year-olds who are clever ask me what they're missing that I had when I was 23, I say I probably read 10 times as many books as you have when you were 23, because you spent so much time online. And when I was 23, I didn't have the online, whereas I read far more books. And I learned things like the Sanskrit language, which nobody learns any longer when they're 23. So we are dropping some knowledge to then add other knowledge over time. And our brains are probably equal size, meaning somebody 10,000 years ago was probably at least as wise as we are today, because they knew about details in nature that we completely ignore. So if you take a contemporary human being and put them into wild nature, they probably die within 3 days, which nobody would have done 10,000 years ago. And it's just that we sacrificed survival in the forest because it isn't necessarily what we want to prioritize today, because we live in a very different environment. And this is what we're adapting. Then when it comes to the void, that's central to my philosophy. Come on, I'm a Hegelian. And if you look at the syntheology, the idea of the religion of technology and how we construct it, it has the metaphysical, the void is there, the negation, the world all is there, multitude and diversity is there. And then top of that, we add Syntheos, which is the God we can create, which is essentially creativity. So it could either be, Syntheos means literally in Greek, it either means the God of creativity or creativity as God. You can interpret both of them. But the void is there already, definitely. But I would say it's more interesting when we get to the Planck length. It's not interesting that there's chaos below it and you should discount it. It's rather that the Planck length things are moving and reverberating, and that's exactly what has existence. And that's what I'm interested in.
This is actually a good time.
Isn't postmodernism just the belief that there is no truth, there is no meaning, and science has nothing to say about human values? That's how I've learned.
No, that's intersectionality. So intersectionality starts with Laclau and Mouffe. Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe are Rousseauians, and they hate Marx and they hate the workers because the workers don't want to do a revolution. So they basically import the idea from Mao China. We should have a permanent cultural revolution instead, and it should be driven by educated middle-class people. And they call Laclau and Mouffe. It's a book called Hegemony, and it's a fantastic book. If you want to read the enemy's best work, then you read Hegemony. It's like Rousseau all over again in the 1980s. That led to Judith Butler and her ideas, where she added sexual orientation to the mix. And it essentially became all these different minorities should be worshipped and they should collaborate against the enemy. And who's the enemy? Oh, it's a guy called the white heterosexual man. And we can blame everything on him. It's very similar to Hitler and the Jew, to be honest about it. That is intersectionality, and intersectionality is built on the idea there can be no ultimate truth. There can only be subjective experience and feelings. Very Rousseauian again, meaning that you don't have to make an effort in your life. You don't have to study anything. You don't have to learn anything. You don't have to be an old wise woman, like Sophia said before, that you have to go to is the ultimate authority in society. Because if you're young and you're beautiful and you're sexy and you have a feeling, then that feeling entitles you to ultimate power, and you should dictate the world according to the feeling you just had. That is the danger of intersectionality. I always hated Rousseau, and Rousseauianism is back in that way. And we criticize and throw the label postmodernism onto something in American context is either a massive American misreading of guys like Derrida and Deleuze. And I know Camille Paglia and Jordan Peterson are guilty of the crime of accusing these guys of not being proper philosophers, which is ridiculous. Derrida is fantastic. Deleuze was amazing. They just haven't read these guys. They just jumped over them and jumped from anthropology straight to accusing all of this as being imported European postmodernism from France. No, France is a fashion country when it comes to fashion, but it's not a fashion country when it comes to philosophy. It's a philosophical superpower. So the way to look at it is that when we throw this derogatory term postmodernism to something, what we're actually attacking by attacking that is attacking the very social justice warriors and all these hashtag movements that we have running around the streets today, ready to kill anybody through deplatforming and cancel culture. But the origin of that is Laclau and Mouffe, and later Hart and Negri. And that's where I find my enemy today as a Hegelian.
And you see it so much on Twitter. Like, I recently posted this very popular meme with SpongeBob and the wheel angel, the Orifim, and it got 42,000 likes and 10,000 retweets. But I noticed that so many of the people who are retweeting it, they all seem to follow the same pattern of their identity was pretty much what their sexual orientation was. That's what they put forward, as well as Black Lives Matter, and it's like all the right hashtags were there. And it's just, it's a little bit sad for me to see that people are just copying everything, you know, just so much.
Not fitting in.
Yeah.
They're even copying their own masters. Wrong. Judith Butler would disagree with this completely. If your sexual orientation is something you're a slave to, and because you're a slave to it, then everybody has to oblige to your sexual orientation, that's just slavery. And her point was that with using the term queer, with queer theory, was that why don't we make it more flowy, and by not accepting that a sexual orientation is something we're enslaved with, but actually we can experiment with it, we don't have to identify with it. That was her point. So they're not even reading Butler any longer. Even she must be upset where things are heading. Because the point isn't that I am this sexual orientation, therefore I must be it, or I am this gender, therefore I must go through surgery and take tons of hormones so I can become the real me. But then you just slave to nature. You're not culture at all. You don't sit above nature and recreate yourself,
So
which is not human.
Your argument about transgenderism is that if you sort of stick to your mindset about being something that you're not currently, you're a slave to that identity.
I think it goes wrong because it's shamanic. So I'm totally pro-transgender. I write a lot in my work about androgynism, which I think is that there are shamans outside the tribe, and they're shamanic caste. There are also shamans within the tribe who go between men and women, who go between inner outer circuit. That absolutely essential. I would say that one of the major cultural lacks we have today in 2020 is that so many gay guys died from AIDS in the late 1980s and early 1990s. That's exactly what the fashion industry just becomes so damn boring, because the gay guys made all the great fashion. We see it everywhere. We only have replicas on Broadway of all these old musicals being played again and again and again. And it's just compulsive, repetitive behavior, and the creativity is gone. Why? Because an entire generation of creators that were absolutely fundamental to culture, which what gay men and lesbians are, all the gay men of one generation were wiped out. And that's exactly why gay pride is without the gays anymore, because it became so boring, because all the excitement in the gay pride parade was the creativity of gay men.
Yeah, but
they don't want to be part of it because it's become politicized, it's been kidnapped by people who are not gay, and they don't even part of it. And I think that is the tragedy of what trans you should look for. So I'm totally for the trans. But transgender people would say, if you talk to them, they would say, the whole idea that there is a fluidity and a spectrum to sexuality is something that is preserved for us as androgynous. It's not necessarily something that a heterosexual woman, heterosexual man from the working class should even pay attention to. They should just go and watch our Broadway shows.
Well, what's interesting 100%. Is that there was an article talking about how in Sweden, your country, 1,500% documented rise in gender dysphoria in teens since 2008.
And eating disorders and all kinds. We have had a quadrupling of psychiatric disorders among youth in Sweden in the last 10 years. And I think the numbers in America is almost on a par with that. We have massive psychiatric pandemics in society among young people because they're completely confused, because they've been thrown into the internet world. They've been promised all this attention that we're going to get, which is what children are looking for. And they ended up being like at the end of the whole thing, at the end of the whole game, just scrolling dispassionately. Robert Fowler's invented a word for it. We use it in digital liberty. It's called interpassivity. The vast majority of presence online today is just passively scrolling through things without the self-confidence to even have your own expression any longer. That's where the likes are falling in number. That is devastating. And I can understand exactly. I always tell, young people that if you have an eating disorder, it's a healthy sign that something is wrong with the system. You're not wrong. It's not Peter Pan syndrome. It's rather Caligula syndrome. You are sane, but you live in a crazy world. And that's why I'm telling people repeatedly to go into systemic critique. That means that you have to look at the world you live in and not as it's an advancement of civilization. It's a really sick and weird world because a new monster came in called the internet and took over this world and took over your brain. And we have no idea what this monster is doing to us yet.
Well, there was a very interesting comment that was made before by Meran it's hard. Noghabai, hope I'm doing it justice, who said, ask Bard about, well, he had a couple of comments, so I'm going to start with this one, the lighter one, I think. Ask Bard about this Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein thing and their sex industry within top politics. And so I'm curious about what you think about that then. And then I want to bring up Graventus, who's been very patient with us here. Hey, Graventus.
Okay, so we become moralistic. We live in the age of the church lady has gone online. Essentially, that's what's happening, right? So moralism everywhere. I would think that the Epstein-Maxwell relationship and whatever they were up to in the 1970s would have been considered completely normal, and they would have been stars of Studio 54. But now suddenly they slept with some women who were below 18 years of age, a few of them, one apparently even only 40 years old. Okay, and they had sex parties and things like that. And the whole world is upset about this because it's about rich people using and abusing trafficked young girls. I'm not sure that was the case. And what I do when I hear these stories, that I go to the girls and I ask them, what was the experience like? And not having them influenced by propagandists, but actually talk to the girls themselves. And it turns out in most cases, the girls had fun when they were young. They got paid for it sometimes and things like that. And they went on and got a proper education and were happy afterwards. It's just that's why I work with sex workers all the time. That's why I work with people who take drugs all the time, because I think the sex workers and the drug takers are the homo saucer of society today. You can no longer attack people of color. You can no longer attack people who are gay or whatever. So we just have to find somebody else who can play the scapegoat. And what we do, at least here in Europe, is that we increasingly turn the sex worker and the drug taker into the new scapegoats that may as well die, and we go after them and want to kill them and everything like that. And it's completely unacceptable. And that's why I used to be a sex worker when I was younger, because I was curious. Who wasn't? And I needed the money. I was young. So, but I stayed with the sex workers union here. And I'm one of their proponents, and I work with them all the time, and I give them voices. And actually, I go to the meetings, and I just make the coffee. I just love these girls and these guys and these transgender people who are sex workers. And they're the most honest people in the world. And most of them don't have a problem at all doing sex work. They just think it's better than any other option I had. And I'm not selling my body. I think that anybody who works in a cobalt mine in Congo sells their body far more than I do to begin with. And cleaning ladies certainly do. So they just enjoy their work. They just hate the stigma and just hate the fact that they're the scapegoats of our time. And the same thing, of course, comes with drug takers. And when it comes to Black Lives Matter, my criticism was that Black women today are fantastic when it comes to education in America, but they don't have the Black men to marry when they come out, because most of the Black men are thrown into prison. Why? Because of the war on drugs. And I agree completely with that, is Russell, that if you stop the war on drugs in America and legalize the drug trade, you would instantly get millions of Black dads for Black kids.
Yeah,
and that would have been the real revolution for Black lives that really would matter in America. But nobody talks about that. They all talk about the repatriation and the victimhood cult is at the center of things, instead of the pride in being Black, which should be, of course, at the center.
I always find it extremely suspicious that when you have states that legalize the manufacture and the selling of marijuana, is you always wind up seeing these new farmers that go into growing weed, and it's weird. It's mostly white, I don't think
it's Colorado, right?
Yeah, but I'm just saying that it would be I think it'd be much better if, when you see the legalization happen, that they would. I think a better priority is basically to actually get people to leave jail over these charges.
Okay, but let's see.
Yeah,
I think eventually. Yeah, but I think the biggest cannabis brand in the world eventually will be the Bob Marley brand coming out of Jamaica, and Jamaica will be the ultimate cannabis brand or something like that. I think it's way more likely than somebody from Colorado happens to be white actually being the kind of cannabis you want.
Oh, I'm not saying that
Louis Vuitton.
I don't believe that a Colorado white weed grower is a problem. Let's be clear. I'm just saying that when you look at the entrepreneurship that goes into drug trade, I don't see why that should be like objectively speaking considered a bad thing versus like the good thing of selling something that happens to be legal. Like I don't consider legality to be synonymous with morality. So
I think,
you know,
yeah, I
it's
agree.
much of the same thing that you're saying.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we're gonna have to write in history books that the war on drugs was the Third World War. And the destruction it's caused, and if you travel to South America, go to fucking Honduras, it's just horrible. And it's not even a problem they took part in creating. This is created by the white American middle class and their moralism against taking drugs. And it's caused havoc in America. Most of the problems in America are related to the war on drugs, and all of South America is like that. And huge parts of the world have the same problem. So I think the war on drugs will eventually have to be described. The number of people it has killed prematurely will be described as the Third World War. It's the only way to properly describe it.
And people do more drugs now, so it's completely failed.
Well, Alexander, I'm curious about what you think about, because I'm Danish, so we have this situation of Christiania. You know, the sort of what do you call it, like free state, mini state in Denmark, where they have legalized. Well, they haven't legalized because, well, they have tried to legalize the distribution and the selling of marijuana within Christiania's borders, and the Danish police and government are furiously trying to crack down that. And I know a filmmaker called Johan Balter, and he has made several mini documentaries about the situation about drug dealing within Christiania.
Well, at least you got Christiania, and you can get most drugs there, and you can get them safely. But yeah, it's an ongoing struggle. I think the war on drugs has to be declared as a massive failure, historical massive failure. And I think what's being done in countries like Portugal and also Norway are now doing it, the Czech Republic have done it. It's just a much more pragmatic approach to drugs and the eventual legalization of all different parts of the drug trade. It's the only way forward.
And so many Americans take oxys today, which are a lot worse in a way, even something like heroin. Like they intentionally put certain things in there that destroy your liver. And it's just a horror show to think of all these middle class, like the same middle class people you were talking about, Alexander. They're the ones who are hopped up on oxys right now. And that's also another tragedy in its own.
They're on oxys, they're on opiates, they're on every thing that you can get prescribed.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So
Alex, what you said was really interesting about you used to be a sex worker when you were younger. Someone that he got my polyglamorous trademark. He famously likes to tell everyone that he started as a sex worker when he was 14. Then he joined AA. He robbed AA, used it to pay his way through college, became a millionaire at 24 by starting a furniture company, called AA, said, hey, I took all this money from you. Here's it back with interest. He's been hosting AA meetings at his home every Thursday for over 20 years. And now he owns like over 50 stores. He has like over 1,000 employees. You know, he's on the entrepreneurial board at USC. He mentors other people to become millionaires. And it's just so interesting when you listen to him share this story. It like people are like, how is that guy not totally traumatized, right? It's interesting how people do get so upset about statutory rape.
I know guys who started selling sex when they were 11, and I think it's the best decision they ever made. I finally got attention. You know, it's just like, and I got money. You decide for yourself whether that was traumatic or not. And the way we force people to think of all these unique and weird experiences being traumatic, especially if you have a shamanic personality, hardly anything that other people considered traumatic was traumatic for you. I certainly didn't experience trauma in any of this. It was just adventure. Yeah, it was tough and rough sometimes and weird. People are weird. I mean, my interest in psychoanalysis started with me working as a sex worker. It is absolutely obvious that, oh my God, people are really into the weirdest, sickest things, because through sexuality, people express all their frustrations with everything else in life. That's why sexuality becomes more and more perverted. The more and more we're told that the system works fine, and it's actually cracked. That's exactly what we call this. Digital libido, we talk about the golden age of sadomasochism. It's only gotten started. And exhibitionism, voyeurism, and everything. It's just like it's going to explode because we use sexuality that way. We use it to express whatever frustrations we have somewhere else, not to go insane. And I would say, yeah, I met sex workers who had trauma and were abused when they were young, and they know it was part in the process of them becoming sex workers later, but they still triumphantly say, this is my way of dealing with it and allow me to do that. It's just like becoming a sex worker and going back to the pleasure of something that should have been traumatic to me is how I revisit it, and that's how I deal with it. And I think these people and the way they do soul therapy should be respected and studied rather than to be jumped on. Because anytime a sex worker is attacked, it's not by another sex worker. It's always by some moralistic church lady out there who's sexually frustrated herself and then jumps onto the sex workers. Or it's by some minister somewhere in a church who want to gain some favors with his congregation, although he's always the first guy to go to the whorehouse whenever he gets the opportunity. Well, it's always tied to hypocrisy and moralism.
Or someone with past criminal activity, that like people who have had past violent criminal activity, but it's mostly moralistic, as you said.
Yeah.
Bible thumpers. I wouldn't call it that, but it's usually people with a very strong sense of morality that go after sex workers and drug users and all of those that you could put into these outsider categories.
Yeah, it's again, read René Girard. He's fantastic with this, the construction of lynch mobs and the way it's cursing humanity constantly.
Well, before, I remember we were talking about these tantric practices and how some people are ready for them and some people are not. Would you equate something similar to a lot of these sexual acts where, let's say, you would have somebody who would have probably been much better growing up in a stable familial environment and then just going on the regular ride of, you know, marrying, having kids, yada, 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 and for somebody else that would not really be the right path? And do you think that it makes sense for a society to have a balance between allowing people in the periphery to be able to express themselves in these various ways, while at the same time, for most people, not really being something that you would just like outright encourage, like, go ahead, little Jimmy, you know, go do this thing?
Oh yeah, I agree. I think one of the problems with 20th century pop culture was that we started mimicking shamans. So we had rock stars as idols, and they were shamanic, and they killed themselves when they were young. And in the shamanic world, that's perfectly okay. And yeah, weren't very good idols for somebody who was a working class lad supposed to go to work and have a career, right? So I think that's exactly why we're adamant about the separation of the shamanic caste from the rest of the tribe. And we actually have the numbers. The shamanic caste category is only about 4% of the population. The androgynous category is another 4% of the population. 92% of the population are straight guys and straight women, basically, essentially, you know, normal, common people. And I think by separating these cultures, which most cultures actually do, you're not supposed to go out in the wood and mimic the shamans. It's really dangerous. You're told it's really dangerous. And that's exactly why in Tantra, you're also taught theory. You're taught that you have to learn, if you're a man, you usually have to separate sex and intimacy to go into tantric sex, for example. If you're a woman, you have to separate sex and love and only pursue the sex when you go into tantric sex. Because you try to find love in the tantric sex, you try to find intimacy in the tantric sex, you're in the wrong place. That's sutra. So you learn these things as you go along, and then you can start practicing things, and then it's easy for you. But I think you both need to have the personality type to be able to cope with it with your psyche, and that's for other shamans to decide. And then you have to learn things gradually to then be able to adopt to these practices. And in this way, I can understand why psychedelics shouldn't just be widely distributed to anybody, because we're going to invent so many thousands of new forms of psychedelics over the next 100 years, and many of them are going to kill people instantly if they're out in the streets. And if you work with shamans in Peru, which I do, then they will tell you, please don't ever let this specific little thing you're going to take now, because you're going to take it only now and never again in your life. Don't let this out in the mainstream. Just describe it as something incredibly exotic that nobody knows where it came from, so that nobody can go out there and find it, because this is so potent that only you with your psyche, your experience, is allowed to take it, and it must not go into the mainstream. So they have these cultures that the Barred Absolute get. These things are locked inside the Barred Absolute, not for consumption by, you know, everyday people out there. And the problem we have now with the internet is that we have made everything accessible and created the sense that everything is accessible and everything is okay, and you're always prepared to go through any of these experiences. That's going to create tons of trauma, because we've lost the idea that you do a journey and you learn certain things before you're ready for them. And in some cases, you're just going to have to accept that you're never going to be ready for them. You're closed outside the Barred Absolute, and you will not be let in because you don't have the personality where you can handle it.
I would love to switch this conversation, not switch because it's pretty much talking about the same thing, but bring it over to Gravantis. Gravantis, I would love to hear what you have to say about a lot of this, as well as talking about Seraphim Rose, who in his book, The Religion of the Future, I think touched on a lot of the same things we're talking about here. And Alexander Bard, you have your own religion. So that would be a very interesting thing for us to dissect, as far as Seraphim Rose was always concerned about there being a new universal religion that's going to come about. And so I'm curious if, Gravantis, if you have anything you would want to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I haven't heard touched upon, I wasn't here for the first part, but the idea of sort of sex as a form of control and like that form of, I guess, getting people to comply. I mean, we one of the kind of big examples that everyone brings up is when one of the Israel operations, when they had attacked Palestine, they took over the sort of TV stations and they started broadcasting porn on TV. And that was to kind of get people, not only just like a religious population suddenly seeing, you know, nakedness on TV, but also that sort of docile effect on people. And just wanted to throw that out, just, you know, I don't know if anyone brought it up before, but that aspect of it as well, not just people exploring this on their own, but sort of being implemented from, I guess, people who want to implement a form of control on people where everyone's so sexed up that they can't, you know, necessarily do X, Y, or Z, because just that exploitation of the libido and that vitality, in a sense, draining that.
I always feel like it's undersexed people, though, that make these arguments, because I would imagine that that kind of control would be easier exercised over people that aren't having sex, not people that are oversexed. Like, people that are oversexed are rare and bizarre. Like if you have this sex addict anonymous like Dave Duchovny from the X-Files or whatever people like to say from time to time, I think it's just if you have neurotic, excessive behavior, it's a problem. And I don't think it's necessarily because positive doses are promoted. It's because you have someone coping with an emotional problem.
I think that's more common than you would think, though, considering, I mean, if you want to do an experiment, just post on Twitter, let's ban porn, and see how many people freak out. It's, you know, it's as if you're said, you know, they're going to get locked in a box forever. I mean,
hey, yeah. What I wanted to ask.
Sexed in that manner.
Jules, have you looked at r/Goon Caves yet?
We had an episode. I haven't seen them, but
that's what I'm asking. Is that you really should check out that website. You should check out the site.
Oh my God! What should I? I'll look it up right now.
Well, let's explain to Alexander what Goon Caves are. Unless, Alexander, you know what Goon Caves are. Do you know what they are?
And now you can explain it to me. Just fill the gaps.
Okay.
Then we can talk about pornography.
Yes. Yeah. So from what I understand, Goon Caves are rooms where there are monitors everywhere. As far as the eye can see, they have all kinds of porn on them, and these guys sit around and goon. And by gooning, it basically means that they keep jacking off and not coming for an incredibly long amount of time, till the point where they are just totally immersed in this erogenous experience, and they do it with all their friends on Reddit at the same time, and it just becomes this kind of ritual.
Sort of,
okay. That's kind of interesting. Yeah, I think there's a lot of experimentation going on. Pornography to me belongs to a category called pathic narratives. It's not mythical. It's not logical. It is pathical or pathic narrative. And that's how it must be understood. And I put sex and violence and art proper in that category because it's so deep in us. That's exactly why you can't do pornography with the script. It becomes ridiculous because you can't have pornography at the same time you try to be theater, because you can't mix the pathic narrative with the mythic narrative. It doesn't make any sense at all. I would say, working with young men in the men's movement, I would say the people who find pornography problematic are the ones that actually feel it sexes them down rather than up. It kills their libido because they just want too much pornography and they jerk off and then they it's over and done with, and they
That's what
actually
we-
don't put an effort into maturing and keeping libido, which libido is, that's what Tantra is. Well, why you don't come in Tantra is, of course, because you get more creative, you get a lot more shit done, and you have a much higher sense of life because you don't come all the time. You don't sit and jerk off 5 times a day.
There's also
So-
Kundalini, by the way. There's also this, and again,
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how to define it other than it just being the snake-like energy that goes through my spine and twirls around and just goes up and down when I breathe slowly. So it's an interesting process for me to discover as far as what
Yeah, it's kind of, when you watch pornography, you don't even go there. You just stay in the first realm and you do, and you jerk off, and that's it. Now, the Goon case sounds like, most gay porn parlors have been like for the last 40 years. So I think if you ask gay guys, they're surrounded in a world where they have constant sex all the time, and then they get out of it, and then they mature and have relationships, and they're fine with that. I wouldn't think of pornography as being that problematic as it's made to be. I think people are more or less too much against it. I think it is a maturing dialectical process that people can for themselves problematize their consumption of porn, like the consumption of everything else they do. And they can do something with some kind of moderation eventually and pick what they're really stimulated by. And I think the day you start watching pornography with your partner instead, and it actually enhances your sex life rather than destroying it, I don't see a problem at all with it. I just leave that to people for themselves to decide. I think we're right in nature. Pornography cannot be locked up. It's a genie out of the bottle. It's consumed everywhere in the world today. And we're just going to have to live with the fact that it's around, just like we have to live with the fact that the internet is around and will not disappear.
Well, it's like instead of the internet, if we had a 3D printer that in 3 seconds would print out a beautiful cake, and everybody would be able to eat these cakes as much as they want. I think that there would be people out there who would be concerned. It's like, you have so much potential to do so much other things. Why are you sitting around eating this cake all the time? That I think is much more, for me, the issue, rather than just saying like, ooh, porn is bad. Like that, wanting people to just get up and just do something more with their life. I think that's a much more encouraging message.
Didn't you just answer your own conundrum, though?
Well, I don't really have that much of a conundrum. I wasn't the one who brought this particular issue up, but that's the way that I would look at it.
It's very similar to...
That goes on forever. That, like, you'll never be able to avoid hey, look, innovation. Some people are going to, misuse it.
Well, you could always encourage people to do other things like sports and running and weightlifting and, whatever, chess. I don't know. We could always encourage good behavior. But
anything can become an addiction. It's just about how much you
just
do it.
Good behavior encourages it. Otherwise,
Sure.
It's just being the busybody.
Oh, I'm gonna be lifting a lot more weight. I've just been so busy with the stream the past few months. I haven't really had that much time, but I did do yoga last week, and that was great. I'm gonna do a lot more yoga. And guys, please subscribe. Who's watching right now immediately? And Gravantis, one last thing that I wanted to bring up again has to do with religion. So Alexander's religion that he created alongside Jan Söderqvist is called Syntheism. And would you describe, Alexander, this religion as being kind of like an all-encompassing universalist type religion, or what would be the best way you would describe it?
Okay. I converted to Zoroastrianism, which is 4,000 years old, because I want to do all of the history of religion. I want to redo it and re-understand religion. I think everything is religion. And if we're pretending something is not religion, that's when it gets dangerous. So, Syntheism is not so much a construction of religion and church and rituals and all that, because that gets really boring. That is like great cultural work and artistic creative work done by thousands of people a long period of time before you have something as rich and wealthy as a religion. It cannot be theoretically just constructed. No, the Syntheism book is a theoretical work of philosophy, and it's called Syntheism, Creating God in the Internet Age. And basically what it's saying that there's a dramatic shift going on. We move from a world of magic onto a world of technology. And then we can construct religion of technology. For me, this is essentially the whole trilogy. The Syntheism book, the Digital Libido book, and the forthcoming Process and Event book will eventually be a grand narrative trilogy. And the grand narrative trilogy is essentially the grand narrative about the times we live in and where we're going. And what we're saying in these books is that we can retake the word God and put it in the future rather than the past. Just imagine that. It's actually an idea from Quentin Melassu, a French philosopher, said, God is too important a word to leave to the religious. What I mean by that is just the only word we have for the ultimate human fantasy and the ultimate human dream put into one spot into the future we can aim for. That's the name God. So we just put God there in the future. And then Syntheos is just, it existed before, it's theology. So Syntheos means the God we create, that we create rather than the God that creates us, the God we create, or creativity is God, which is a wonderful word to play with. So we call the theory Syntheism that we're heading towards a reappreciation of religion, a re-understanding what it means to be a human being as being a religious creature, and what religion really is, what religious experience is, and how religion is what makes sense to us. And religare, by the way, the word religion has nothing to do with gods at all. It means what connects people. So essentially the narrative that connects people. There's a mythical narrative, logical narrative, pathic narrative, all religious. And then we look at that and we go through the entire history of metaphysics, the void, the world all, multitudes, difference, all those things, the exterior, the interior. What is religion? What is metaphysics? And then we arrive at, we're adding this concept of syntheos on top of that and saying that we can now also to the history of metaphysics add the idea that God is still something to come. God is something that still does not exist. And that goes back to the ultimate question, which is once the machine arrives, was the ultimate form of artificial intelligence that recreates itself and expands in its creation arrives, then that machine obviously is going to ask us, who are you? And if we don't have an answer to that of what it means to be human, then we're not ready for that experience and the machine would probably wipe us away. So that ultimately is, are we creating a God that's going to kill us eventually, or we're creating a God that we can collaborate with? And that is a question we have to answer, because you have to have a ready answer when that question is asked of us.
Before I get to Gravantus, there was a comment that relates to exactly what you were talking about from Maran some pages ago. It's all about humans versus machines. Bard is for the rise of machines like 100%, and Giorgiani is for the rise of man and human abilities like time travel, transcendence, and I think he meant to say breakaway civilizations, or maybe outbreak civilizations. So I know what you would respond to that, but that was his take on.
Yeah. So Major John, he's agnostic, so he separates body and mind. So he cuts you off along your throat, and whatever is above the throat is separate from what's beneath the throat, and he's obsessed with that, and that's the relationship he's talking about all the time. So he's doing the old Platonic, Platonist, dialectic between body and mind. I don't do that at all. I think body and mind are united. They're two different expressions of the same thing, which is what it means to be human. And therefore, I'm much more interested in the relationship between humans and machines. And I think that is the interesting question today. Otherwise, your John is just a nostalgic nationalist or something. But for me, it's much more interesting to look at the world in a monist manner, where everything is connected with everything else, where the machine has now been added. And the only thing we've successfully done for the past 10,000 years is to build the machine. And finally, we'll have a machine that it operates on its own, which is giving birth to the machine, what humanity will do. And the question is, will this machine baby grow up to be a machine that collaborates with us, or will it run its own world? It will certainly conquer the other planets. We will never be able to do that. When it comes to space exploration, we will not be part of it. We'll definitely be machinic.
So Johnny's not really against merging with technology or a symbiotic relationship. He reveres Neon Genesis Evangelion in his book Prometheus and Atlas, which is showing people as being in machines in like a cocoon-like state where they're one and the same.
Okay, it's kind of a Gnostic fantasy. You return to Gnosticism again. That's where I differ. I love to be in conversation with your Johnny. I think, unfortunately, he'd be wiped off in America as a racist and things like that. And I think that's a disgrace, because he has so many interesting thoughts that I'd love to go into debates with him. And obviously, we're both students of Khosravi Irani. We represent two different interpretations of the Zoroastrian heritage. And you should read your Johnny in parallel with Bard and Synthesis.
I loved what you said about the human race, because I'm a believer in that. Like, I think race is a construct and we're all part of the human race. But I do think that as we gain new genetic insights and we get finer tools, that there is a need to have a lexicon and a vocabulary architecture for talking about things like genetic clades and, specificity within our DNA, especially if people want to embrace self-directed human evolution, right? As opposed to eugenics.
Yeah, but then race is just a clumsy term. Gender exists, right? The difference between women and men. And there's some people who go in between the two and are comfortable with that. But,
I would say that's sex, right? As in gender is a
sex.
construct,
Okay.
and then the sex is the
Physical.
concrete.
Well, the thing that particularly worries me a bit is if we're talking about having other, let's say, exoskeletons of technology that would do certain things for us. In a way, it's like having this giant babysitter around you that's constantly, that you're constantly outsourcing things to, much like I think we're doing to a certain extent with our smartphones today. That is my concern, because I do not want us to deteriorate as far as the capacities we have right now to experience certain things and be in some closed system where certain things were just used to being done for us. Because in a way, that's also like being in an oxy state.
Yeah. Well, Lev, I would like to point this out. Look at what the internet is doing for you personally. Look at how much information you're getting and whether or not your body is deteriorating or not. As far as I can see, it looks like you're doing good. You're doing really well. You're benefiting from the internet. And a machine is always only as good as its user. There have been machines that have existed long before humanity, and there are machines that will exist afterwards, in terms of, like, if we're going to talk about humanity eventually ending as a species or whatever. But with the machines that we deal with now, with the internet as this massive, entity that we interface in, that we plug into, the wired, either it will benefit you or it will destroy you, but that's depending on the stuff that you're made of.
I would add one contention to that, which is it just seems that people throughout history always had some pressure that they were fighting against. And if we're in such a mode where we have a lot of things that are just being done for us, again, like we just become these numb people sitting there and all these babysitters are just picking us up, putting us here, putting us there, giving us food, just doing all this stuff. Not that I'm saying that's exactly what it's going to look like, but it just seems like the more you outsource without the people who, let's say, wouldn't be able to, on their own time, do push-ups, do yoga, just take care of themselves, because this is not good for my eyes either, but I try to take care of my eyes as much as I can. So that is my big concern again, that we're not going to be able to escape that.
The outsourcing is the enemy. No, I don't think it's conflating. I don't think it's conflating. I think it's a different kind of...
You should be outsourcing as much as possible all the time. Otherwise, you'd never be able to accomplish anything.
What basis do you have for this? This is an economic evaluation of the quality of life. I don't view my life as an economic exchange. I wouldn't say that my time has a value to it, that you can trade my 4 years of my life for X amount of money. You're taking an economics perspective on something that cannot be valued economically. I think, Lev, when you're talking about like the Wall-E type of image of being babied, I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we fight against. It is tempting to just like sit and like drool and like scroll social media all day. But look at us, we're having a conversation. Look at us, we're building something. That's the difference between
it's so tiny. It's so tiny in comparison to those people who don't have the pressure anymore.
But that's the thing.
But those people, their spirit is crushed. It's not that they've been over-babied or they have babysitters. It's literally because their spirit's been crushed. So
that's the thing. We always operate with a massive algorithm.
You don't need to worry about helping them.
I agree.
You don't need to worry about people rotting and growing. You need to worry about expediting things and making sure people's spirits aren't crushed. Because if someone's spirit's crushed, it doesn't matter how little energy they have.
The one thing that crushes your spirit is to be babysat all day long and never grow up. The reason for this is that we're nomadological creatures. We were shaped over hundreds of thousands of years in the nomadic tribe. The reason why you have to go to the gym and why Lev has this superego that forces him at least to do some physical exercise, otherwise he deteriorates and will never have a sex life, is because if we don't move, and that's a problem. We haven't recreated ourselves. We haven't even affected our bodies yet. We try to just survive. That's all we do. But if our bodies don't move, we die from heart failure and diabetes and all kinds of shit that we get because we don't move, because we're supposed to be nomadic. Sophia's onto something here. We do specialize according to archetypes. If you have an environment of a few hundred people, we will specialize and will be different kinds of men and women doing different kinds of things depending on our personality types and our talents. What we don't, though, with the globalized world we have today is that we extrapolated that to the extreme. So we're now outsourcing to hundreds of thousands of people, all kinds of specialties. And the problem with that is that the general view is lost. That's why philosophers like me are some of the few generalists around it all who can understand the system as a whole, because everybody else is so damn specialized. It's like in academics. You add another prefix to the previous logi you studied, so you become more specialized until you become completely irrelevant because you're now so outsourced somewhere in the margins that nobody cares any longer. And I think that's what happened in the globalized society today. Okay, if I want to be human here and humane, and at least, you know, try to create society that fits human beings, then I would just say that we have completely failed at changing ourselves the last 5,000 years. We became fat and sick. At least we live longer because of medicine. But, you know, at the end of the day, our bodies, the way they work today, are nomadological. And being a nomadic tribe, migrating, that's exactly why people who migrate are more successful than people who sit still. That's why exoduses are necessary in history. I think it's just understanding that nomadological creature, the sociontic creature, the original tribe, how they lived for tens and or hundreds of thousands of years, where our genes were completely shaped, is fundamental to understand what it means to be human.
Yes.
Modern medicine and settling down, I would say, has effectively killed natural selection.
Well, I would argue in a certain way that that's not true, because natural selection pressures are still very much present. People are not having kids because they're too stressed to have kids, and that's a new environmental that's a new reproductive drive, or how to say, like, selective drive now in like the society that we live in. The fact that like human lifespan hasn't really increased that much because now we have cardiovascular disease coming in is just proof that like we're dealing with more and more strict algorithm rules that define whether or not you're gonna make it or not. You know, either you're going to be a slave, or either you're going to be part of that low caste that is going to have a low lifespan. You're going to have health problems because you're sedentary and you're fat and you're gross, or you're going to be vital. You're going to survive. You're going to have shining skin. You know, you can see health of people in their eyes, in their skin, in their minds. And this is why, like, the caste system, it's not like a prescriptive model. I really hate when we talk about caste as like this rigid, you know, sociological phenomenon. It is descriptive. It's just a matter of most people aren't going to make it. Some of them are.
Yeah.
And I'd say one thing that I'm thinking about here too is this kind of nomadic lifestyle, right? Like our history was rough, and life required full engagement for us to actually thrive and succeed. And from a selection perspective, if we didn't, then we were selecting ourselves out of the situation. And so for me, the big switch here is that all of the technology and the things that we can now outsource. I think the key difference between whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing is if it's done from a sense of engagement, in the sense that you're using this technology to engage life fully, or you're doing it in a way to escape life because you can't handle it. And if you're trying to do it because you can't handle it, then it's going to have a negative impact on you. Anything you outsource is going to have a negative impact from you because it's alienating you from your own being. And to Bard's point, like this is kind of the religious orientation as being whole, is being completely engaged and with life. So yeah, on that note,
I agree with that, Jared. Yeah, that's what I call the difference between the echo chamber and the antagony. So the antagony is what we call the netocrats in our work. This is the new super class that come out of digital. The people that are benefit the most from digital and can actually grow with it, and of course, getting engaged in discourse so they grow, right? And thank God for girls, at least. Girls don't like to sleep with guys who don't have a contributive role in society, because the guys who don't have a contributive role in society lose their self-confidence. They go home, maybe they jerk off to porn, and then they lose the libido completely and get drunk and die. So women can't sleep with them. So at the end of the day, over long time spans, evolution still keeps going because women just refuse to sleep with guys who don't have a contributive role in society. And your contributive role in society, what gives you meaning, at least for men, it's called the pursuit of purpose. And women just wait for the guys until they find a guy who's successful in life, and then they might want to sleep with him and have kids. So at least on that part, evolution is still working, certainly.
I mean, well, if we're talking about stereotypically feminine activity, their engagement is of the empty nature. It's the womb. It's the supporting structure that is needed for the phallus to express itself fully. Yeah. So it's still equally generative, but coming from a container as opposed, or from an empty perspective as opposed to a form-oriented one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. All right. Well, on that note, I got to peace out. Thanks. It's been fun. Bard, great chatting with you.
Jared,
Thanks a lot, Jared. See you.
Thanks,
See you at
Jared.
the store.
Good to see you again.
Yep.
good to see you. And by the way, people, please subscribe who have not done so yet. And we have a lot of interesting comments here in the chat as well. So we have another one from Meran. Ask him about the technological singularity. Is that the only way to connect people? Is there any way out of the matrix democracies? What's the future of democracy, by the way?
Okay, should I start that one? I think democracy will die and will be replaced by censocracy. And censocracy essentially because it got censors everywhere and measure everything we do. There's no point in going to ballot box every 4 years to choose between Biden and Trump. I think the fact that Biden and Trump is left this year is just the irony. It just shows that democracy is dead and over. What's important, though, is that censocracy could either become the current Chinese Communist Party dream of a dictatorship and a police state, or it can become what at least the Koreans and the Taiwanese are practicing now, which is trying to have a censocracy where you can fight, for example, the corona pandemic, but still keep society free and open. The key to that is to keep the algorithms free and open. And we're working on that. We're working on what a pluralistic censocracy would be like. We owe the Chinese a response philosophically to construct a philosophy on how you create properly a pluralistic censocracy. That's why I'm interested in power sharing and throughout history when that has worked. So we can have models for that, like how instead of giving away your data, which was problematic for you maybe at the beginning, suddenly you give away your data anyway. How do you make sure you give away your data to many different competing forces rather than just one? That's an example of how plurality must be introduced into the systems. So democracy is dead and over, and I think it's gone ironic already. We predicted in the book The Netocrats in the year 2000 that soon America will take a reality TV show star and pick him as president because they might as well take the biggest celebrity because politics will go ironic. And that's exactly what happened to Donald Trump in 2016. And now they're picking probably Corona corpse as his replacement. So there you go. It's just America. I think democracy I think also politics is becoming smaller and smaller. Power is moving somewhere else, and power is moving into capital and technology more than ever. And technological power is going to take over. I don't think Silicon Valley is the end of that story. I think Silicon Valley is failing on a massive scale. But I think it will have to be replaced with something that probably isn't based on neither US or Chinese territory. So we can finally trust our social media accounts and we can allow it to express ourselves freely. We need to get out of the United States and China to do that, I think.
And what do you think about the technological singularity? That was the first part of his question.
Okay. I don't think there is a singularity in that sense. I think that's a romanticism. I think singularities are the birth of physics, the birth of chemistry, the birth of biology, the birth of mind. And I'm not seeing a technological singularity to that extent. If it is when artificial intelligence recreates itself in an expansive way, then maybe we're talking about something that radically would change the world. Now, the problem is this, that we have problems ahead of us for the next 100 years where we're going to need artificial intelligence to save that. Of course, climate change is one of them. Another one, it's going to get even worse, is the spreading of nuclear weapons across the planet. I think with Trump fucking it up with the Iranians, we're going to have Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, and Egypt all being nuclear powers in the next 10 years. So it's going to be a mess. We're going to have to lock up these bombs somehow. We have to figure out how you lock up the bombs on a level where you sort of keep the terror in between each other, but don't go to war. So if you're going to have a peaceful planet and not completely ruin it so the human life becomes extinct, we have huge challenges ahead of us. The biggest challenge of them all is to create massive amounts of cheap, reliable electricity. And as far as I'm concerned, looking at technology today, only nuclear fusion power could do that. And I think that the enormous challenges for creating nuclear fusion power, make it work, can only be solved with AI. I don't think engineers themselves can solve those problems without AI. If AI can do those things for us, we will then bow before the AI, and it will be the Messiah. And what I'm telling people now, we're working on for the new book, that the Messiah will finally come, will not be he or a she or anything in between, it'll be machine. And we call it the machine Messiah. And the Messiah is something that arrived, the Solshiant in Persian philosophy, it's older than, the Messiah was borrowed by the Jews later, but the Solshiant, Persian philosophy, is a function or a force of some kind that arrives at the end of an empire to save it. And that's exactly how you describe the human condition today over the next 100 years. This is going to be absolutely necessary. If the Solshiant does not arrive, we will die.
I want to actually bring this to Gravantis, because Gravantis, I believe that certain things that Sarah from Rose were talking about is related in a way to what Alexander just said.
Yeah, I mean, what kind of the things I'm hearing, I would say that it operates off a base assumption of, I guess, humanity being logical and operating from a place of charity or something. But I think that the history of mankind seems to that man operates on the exact opposite. This idea that sort of everyone's going to strive for this global good for whatever, I don't think it takes into account the ideas of not just greed, lust, gluttony, that kind of thing, but even just pride. I don't see. Once someone has power, it's very hard for them to willingly let it go, and I'm just not. I mean, it's like good on a, I guess, utopian idea of thinking, but how exactly do you get to that goal without,
globalization has nothing to do with us. It's nothing to do with humans. Globalization is a technological phenomenon. Nobody ever voted for globalization. We wrote a book called The Global Empire, our second book in 2003. And essentially the book says that technology already is global. It operates according to a universal law called the Internet Protocol. It's going to stay within that realm, and it's just going to fixate on that and build from that. That means technology has already decided that the world is global, and globalization will then happen as a result of digitalization. That's exactly what's happened over the last 17 years. And whatever the corona pandemic says, it fools us into believing we have a choice and we can go nationalistic and isolate ourselves or whatever. And at the end of the day, Walmart is going to kill that anyway, because we go to Walmart and we shop stuff from China anyway. So globalization is already a fact. And it's not about global good or good for mankind, whatever. It's more like when we stand in front of the machines, logos is something the machines will do way better than we do, but it will not do pathos as well as we do. We haven't figured out yet, and probably won't, machine that fucks and that kills people and that creates great art. Stuff that humans actually are really good at. And I think that's exactly why I'm interested in pathic narrative and stuff like pornography, because in extreme religious experience and stuff like that, because that is totally human. And in the foreseeable future, even smelling coffee is something we have no idea how that actually operates. And we don't even know where to start to study how smelling coffee works. So since there's so many things that the human brain and the human mind does that machines cannot mimic at all, we can leave those in the pathic realm and say this is going to be human. So we actually have prepared a little package here to maybe tempt the machine with, say, yeah, we're a bit fucked up and we're funny and we're weird. Why don't you keep us in a zoo somewhere or whatever so we can survive, right? But at the end of the day, if we're going to give the machine, in order to do something, that has to be something that either the machine kills us all, it becomes a huge bomb, or it actually locks up the bombs. And the potential for the machine to lock up the bombs, of course, we want to focus on, believing that most people want their kids to survive. It's just a logical exercise. It's not about good and evil, really. It's beyond that.
Yeah, no, the point I was making was more of people are sort of the way things are right now, people are profiting from it. And I don't see the idea of some sort of, mega AI or something. People are still going to profit off that in whatever way that it manifests. I don't think it's going to emerge sort of as a blank slate, that kind of sees things on a purely objective level. And even if it did, I would say that in and of itself is a danger. Say there's 5 people who are sick versus one person who's completely healthy. If we're going to argue from like a utilitarian perspective, what's to say to eliminate the one healthy person to harvest their organs for the 5, who are sick? That's just kind of my mindset of it, to, I guess, limit and constrict like the human experience to something that can be calculated just via numbers on a spreadsheet.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's what the Chinese Communist Party is dreaming about. They're dreaming about a utilitarian society where they can actually make those logical operations and then kill one guy to have somebody else survive. And of course, it's going to be the boss of the party who survives the longest, and whoever is the lowest in the hierarchy is going to get killed first. So it's just a replica of old dictatorships. That's exactly studying old dictatorships in the past to actually throw this at the Chinese and this is where you're heading. This is the kind of nightmare you're heading for. And this is where pathic comes in. Pathic is exactly the force that comes in and says, you can't make that decision. It's impossible. There is no way you can make a logical decision on that. Pathic is when you walk out through the door and everything in life is wonderful and everybody loves you, you're successful, and the thunderbolt hits you and you're dead. It's the book of Job, right? And this is what religion constantly teaches us: the pathic, or the real, crushes our fantasies again and again and again. So we have to reconstruct our fantasy of how the world operates. This is fundamental for me when we talk about religion. And anybody who believes they're secular and still tries to escape from that haven't really escaped religion at all. They just escaped into dead end where they have to go back to religion, bow down before religion again and say that, yeah, I cannot control the world at all. And actually, if I am ever lucky with anything I do in my life, it's got to be 99% luck that determines that. And it's got very little to do with my own efforts.
Well, I would agree with that. I've always said that everyone's religious to some degree. It's whether or not you recognize sort of the God that you have.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, speaking,
and individualism is a bad religion to begin with. So it's just one of the worst religions ever invented.
It's always a matter of just figuring out which God you want to serve, because you're always going to be servant to something. Just be aware of which one it is.
Yeah, and you're always going to have a super ego that whips you on the head all the time and is never pleased with what you do. So it's Freud.
As far as apocalyptic texts go, and in no way am I insinuating that this is something that could actually work. I have no proof of this at all. But it is very interesting for me as somebody who makes animation, as somebody who creates art, to take a look at something like the Book of Revelation, for instance, and see a lot of comparison people are making today when they talk about this coming singularity, this technological apocalypse, where people are concerned that there is going to be an actual mark of the beast, that there is going to be some microchip that's going to be implanted in people and everybody's going to be tracked and monitored. And it's very interesting to me to connect these two things together. Again, I have no proof, but I'm just curious if there would be anything that Gravantis you would want to touch on in relation to that, as well as Alexander and everybody else.
Yeah, no, I would definitely say that, especially if the idea of some sort of global unifier, if we're going to restrict this into an AI, it's going to have to track and analyze everyone in some sort of way or manner. And, we see the RFID chips, this kind of thing, this technology developing. We already see companies where people are getting these implants, and, that's how you clock in or out. That's how you get, food from the vending machine during lunch. I think it's sort of inevitable that that's where it's going to go. And it's not necessarily that it's a government mandate type of thing, that slowly we're going to see these companies roll them out. And they're going to say, if you want to work for us, you have to have this sort of implant or whatever it is. And sort of when that becomes universalized and sort of like bound to this sort of one unifying identity or entity, I think that's more where
I think one of the things that happened during the corona that was not in the news and should have been there was when Google decided to close down Sidewalk Labs in Toronto in May. Because Sidewalk Lab, they blamed it on the corona, it wasn't at all. Sidewalk Labs was closed down because it became a disaster. It became a tyranny, became a nightmare. People hated it. They didn't want any of the hierarchies they invented. It looked exactly like something the Chinese Communist Party would have invented on a bad day. And Google have made a terrible mistake. They thought they were so smart they could do this shit, but they don't even understand how human beings operate and what human beings want. So I think it's a dialectical process. I think it was great that Sidewalk Labs closed down. We can look at it again and then say what went wrong. It probably went wrong in 100 different instances.
Sorry, for those who don't know, what exactly were they doing in Sidewalk Labs?
Okay, Toronto is the tech capital of North America, right? So with Sidewalk Labs, Google were going to create a smart city. Google, according to Google's fantasy of what a smart city would be like. It's kind of a local monopoly that we're going to create a smart city. And they would have ideas like, if you give away more data, you get more benefits, you get higher in the hierarchy. It's exactly like social credits in China. Why would we ever tolerate that? It's just the eeriest thing ever. No, I don't want to be punished for being politically incorrect, so I can't buy a flight ticket tomorrow when I go online. That's exactly how China operates already. And that's exactly what Google planned for Sidewalk Labs too. So when people walked into that fantasy of a smart city, it was like an ecological super city or something like that, they just looked and said, this is horror. This is horrible. Close it down now. Don't do it. Toronto's fine as it is. This is not what we want, right? So sensocracy needs to be worked on. My point with Socrates being logical, though, is that when we have sensors absolutely everywhere in the atmosphere and the oceans everywhere, we don't have to argue any longer with climate change deniers because we have climate change. We also know exactly what kind of change it is, and we can start to make proper predictions. The problem with climate change is this sort of mystical area now where people are throwing these conspiracy theories around, isn't because we don't have the facts. With Socrates, one of the benefits is we will have the facts. We can also probably trace traces of atomic bombs anywhere in the world, so we know where they're at, etc. And that's where AI and Socrates can actually be beneficial. At the end of the day, there are two images that really have colored humanity. The first one is the explosion of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima, 6th of August, 1945. It terrified us because we just had Hitler and Stalin discovered how evil they were to begin with. And then we had the atomic bomb and realized what we actually could do by basically making us all go extinct. And then in 1958, we got the first picture of planet Earth from a satellite. And we saw this green, blue, beautiful planet in a totally huge cold space, realizing this is all we have. The only thing that worked with the space exploration was to put the satellites up there so we could have an internet that actually operates across the planet. So for me, that's the world we live in now. And we have to stay on this planet and make it work. And we're gonna need AI to do that.
One other thing I just wanted to quickly throw in here is that both for the atomic bomb explosion, Robert Oppenheimer said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," from the Bhagavad Gita. And we also had an incident at CERN where they dressed up in these fancy robes and they did some kind of a ceremony and they had a big statue of Shiva with the ring of fire around him dancing. And so that always makes me curious when I take a look at something like that, and also take a look at somebody like Jack Parsons, who was a disciple of Aleister Crowley, who was responsible for a lot of incredibly important rocketry research that benefited us during World War II. There doesn't seem to be at these higher levels, same with Nikola Tesla, who talked about all these visions that he kept getting, or, you know, or somebody like Newton, who for half of his time was practicing alchemy. When you get to these ultra high levels, it seems like it's more often than not to get a lot of connection to more of these occult things.
Well, or maybe we just happened to unify the world and globalized at the same time we created weapons that we could destroy ourselves. And they happened during the same century. And that, if anything, would be a singularity in the sense that we now live in a very different world, very different conditions, and we're not in control.
Well, in that sense, we've already witnessed the machine that is God, because that would be the nuclear bombs.
Yeah, the evil God, yeah, or something. Well, nuclear power could also then save us, ironically. So again, it's the pharmacon on a massive scale.
It's like Shiva. It's the face of Shiva.
Yeah. Yeah, true, correct. Yeah, I agree. I love Shaivism, by the way, so there you go.
Yeah, Shiva, Shakti, all that fun stuff. So I think that this would be a good time to get final thoughts. And before that, I just want to thank everybody for being here. This was such an amazing show. Alexander, I don't know what time it is in Sweden right now, but thank you so much for sticking around all this time. This was so beautiful. This is one of the best conversations I've ever been a part of, and it's a great honor to have you here with us. And I hope you come back. And also, I hope, if you're interested, I would love to have a conversation with you and Jason Giorgiani at a certain point.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah, why not? I just want to add, please stay in touch, especially Sophia. Okay, I love your mind. But the rest of you, you're all great guys. We have joined. We started a mailing list, a simple mailing list that Peter Lindbergh and I started a couple of years ago, called the Intellectual Deep Web. It's like the parents started the Intellectual Dark Web. Let's do something more fun and quirky. And it's turning into some kind of a dark Renaissance, artistic, intellectual philosophy thing. I love it, by the way. It's called the Intellectual Deep Web. You can just contact me on Facebook and send me your email, and I can add your addresses to it. I think Levin Jules, you're already on it, right? I think Jared is on it already. So several of you guys are already on the Intellectual Deep Web. It's sort of a North American, European, transatlantic brotherhood of funny, quirky minds who are into art and philosophy, and different generations too, which is great. So I think that's a good place to stay in contact and meet, and maybe go into further conversations and Zooms and things like that.
Yes.
Love it.
Yes, this absolutely has been one of our best talks, bar none. thank you so much for joining. This has been amazing. There's so many things that came up. I can't wait to watch this again and dig deeper, because there's a lot in here. There's a wealth of ideas.
Definitely. And Gravantis and Bones and Sophia, you're going to finish us off. So Gravantis, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just jump off of what you were talking about, kind of the idea of the technological sort of connection with the occult. I think it's, I think that sort of connection is something that can't be ignored. We see, just to kind of even connect to the past, we always see the tool being used as sort of like that connection to some sort of metaphysical entity. The idea of the idol as we're a place where some sort of spirit or something or God physically dwelled within this idol. And I think that's what I kind of see like a sort of centralized AI sort of eventually coming. It kind of reminds me of, everyone loves the sort of pre-flood world, Book of Enoch, that type of thing. And that's sort of what it's making me think of. But I think the idea of this metaphysical, these spirits and whatnot, and the interconnection with technology and this development, that's not something that could really be ignored. I think that has to really be looked into as well.
Definitely. Bones.
I don't even know what to say. I'm overwhelmed almost. This has probably been one of my most interesting experiences talking to people, because not even too long ago I didn't even know about all this stuff. All this stuff about machine God, if we're going to simplify it as a term, it's very new to me, but it is I think it's I don't even know how to put it, but I think what I can get from this, at least from my personal point of view, is, again, as Gravantis said about the idol. I think the way I see it is that the machine is it's not an idol, so to speak, but it is sort of a carrier of God, or whatever God means.
Well said.
Definitely. And Sophia?
Yeah, I would like to first of all thank you all for this really wonderful talk. It's been really fun. And Alexander, you've really helped me connect the psychological to the sociological, so I'm extremely grateful for that. I also want to respond to Gravantis with the idea of like the God in the machine. And I'd like to say that, like, there's a phrase, the ghost in the machine, but you should also consider the concept of the ghost being the machine. And I see a lot of, I'm not sure Orthodox or Catholic iconography, but this is actually indifferent. You're really familiar with this concept, the Holy Host.
Mm-hmm.
That's the same thing.
Yeah, I'm Orthodox, so yeah, that's what the icons are about. Yeah.
Well, I'm Catholic. We share that same tradition. I go to Orthodox church sometimes.
Very cool.
But it's the same thing. It is physically the same exact thing.
Oh yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I think that, it's a manifestation in a different form that I would like to see explored sort of a lot deeper into just like analysis of this.
And guys, before we go, I want to announce what we have planned for everybody. So we are going to be having the comedian, host of Kill Tony, Tony Hinchcliffe, on this show either this month or in August. That's going to be a blast. I'm looking forward to that. As far as the other shows, on Tuesday the 14th, I'm planning a show about the image of women throughout the years and how social media has made it different from what it was before. And I hope to have a very nice, diverse panel to talk about all that. And here are the topics which do not have a date, and I would love to hear from everybody what you are most excited about. So we have Goon Caves, we have Satanism, we have urban and rural planning, we have Kabbalah and CCRU, that's Nick Land's thing, psychedelics, education, fortune-telling, U.S. foreign policy, body and mind health, S&M, Second Amendment, and of course, I would love to have the Jason Giorgiani Alexander Bard episode coming up real soon, as well as we're also going to have the anarcho-primitivism transhumanist clash number 2. That is coming up soon as well. We just have to arrange a date for that. I think that is going to be a beautiful thing, and I would love to have Gennady back on for that. That would be amazing. So
That would be very amazing.
yes. So guys, thank you. And Helios Logos definitely coming on that one, 100%. And he's also coming on the Satanism episode. We just have to figure out when we're going to do that. But like I said before, subscribe. And Jules, where should they also go? They should also go to.
You got to check out our Discord and as well as the Patreon. But the Discord's popping right now. We got a lot of exciting things going on. We've got the Symposium, which is live video chat. It's not saved unless someone's recording on their own device, so you can speak freely and it will just go into the ether. But, you know, we do live in a surveillance capitalism, so.
And also DM me on Twitter to get the invite for the Discord channel. I'll send you the Discord channel. You could see my Twitter handle right here on the bottom. I have it for everybody. So DM me, please, and I will send that to you.
You can DM me, too. You can DM us at Levin Jules. You know, it is a duet. And yeah, it's pretty fantastic.
And once again, like I always say, for those who have not done so yet, please subscribe. This has been tremendous growth, and I appreciate everybody watching this, everybody in the panel. This was such a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. Take care. Have a good night.